Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity gets cozy and the oldest stories in the world find their way back into quiet corners of your mind. Tonight, we're stepping gently into a legend that has lived for over 6,000 years. Older than pyramids. Older than writing as most of us imagine it. A story whispered from clay, about gods who came from the sky, walked among the first humans, and perhaps, depending on how you choose to see it, made us who we are. So wherever you're listening from, your room, your car, or maybe just that in-between moment before sleep, settle in for a little while. Let the noise of the day drift away. Because what we're about to explore might just be the oldest origin story ever told. If you find this journey soothing or intriguing, if it keeps your mind peacefully turning while your body slows down, it would mean a lot if you'd like the video or subscribe. It helps this little corner of calm find others who enjoy wandering through mystery, science and myth with a cup of quiet curiosity. So, let's begin. Somewhere between earth and heaven lies a world that was once called Sumer, a landscape of rivers and reeds, of mud brick cities glowing in the dawn, of farmers who watched the sky as if it were a library full of secrets. Long before the idea of gods with wings or halos, before angels and devils, there were the Anunnaki. To the people of ancient Mesopotamia, these were not distant deities perched beyond clouds. They were beings who came down from the heavens, ruled the earth, and sometimes quarrelled like kings. They taught humans how to write, how to farm, how to build. And according to some interpretations, they may have done far more than that. They may have shaped humanity itself. If that sounds like myth, that's because it is, or at least that's how history has recorded it. But myth is rarely just a story. Myths are how civilizations remember. They compress centuries of change, fear and hope into narratives that survive when empires fall. When we talk about the Anunnaki, we're not just retelling old tales about divine architects. We're touching the pulse of how humans first tried to explain themselves. Imagine the scene. Around 5,000 years ago, somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the night sky was astonishingly clear. No streetlights, no airplanes, only a dome of stars so sharp and bright that you could almost believe they were watching back. The first astronomers of Sumer didn't look at the sky for decoration. To them the stars were alive, full of messages. Every movement of light above was tied to a movement below. The heavens were not a faraway ceiling. They were a map of meaning. In that world, when someone said the gods came from the sky, it wasn't an exaggeration. It was literal truth as they knew it. The Sumerians left us more than imagination. They left clay tablets, thousands of them, inscribed with wedge-shaped symbols called cuneiform. Many of these tablets describe their gods: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna. And woven through those names is the word Anunnaki, a collective term meaning those who came down from heaven. They were said to descend from Anu, the sky god, and to govern different aspects of the world: water, air, fertility, wisdom, law. They weren't distant, untouchable deities. They were administrators of existence itself, each with duties, hierarchies, and disputes. The oldest bureaucrats in the cosmos, if you will. Some stories say the Anunnaki created humans to bear the weight of labour that the gods themselves no longer wanted. Others say they made us to be companions, caretakers of their earthly domain. And others still describe something stranger, a merging of divine and mortal essence, a moment when clay met breath, and a new kind of being stood up for the first time. We'll get to that story later. For now, what matters is how calmly the ancient texts speak of these sky beings. There's no sense of disbelief, no debate. The people who carved these words simply recorded what they understood to be true. It's easy to dismiss such accounts as fantasy, but consider this. Nearly every civilization that rose after Sumer carried echoes of the same story. Gods from the heavens teaching humans, ruling for a time, and then withdrawing. The Egyptians had their Osiris and Thoth, the Maya their feathered serpent, the Greeks their Titans, Each culture told it in its own language, yet the pattern never really changed. The idea of knowledge descending from the sky is older than history and for some reason has refused to fade. Archaeologists, of course, approach this differently. They see the birth of civilization in practical terms: irrigation, agriculture, trade. But even among the most rational accounts, the Sumerians remain an anomaly. They appeared almost suddenly around 3500 BCE, already building cities, creating complex laws, dividing time into hours, and tracking celestial cycles with astonishing precision. No slow crawl from hunter-gatherer camps to civilization, just an abrupt arrival of literacy, architecture, and organized religion. It's as if someone flipped a switch in human culture. For some, that's evidence of a leap, either in intellect or influence. For others, it's just what happens when enough small innovations finally stack up. Still, the feeling persists that something unusual happened there, in that flat land of mud and stars. And that feeling has kept the Anunnaki story alive long after the cities of Sumer turned to dust. Picture a quiet evening in the city of Eridu, the place the Sumerians called the first city on Earth. The air smells faintly of baked clay and river silt. Lamps flicker in small courtyards, and from the temple at the city's centre, a ziggurat rises like a staircase to the sky. Priests move slowly up its steps carrying offerings. At the top, beneath the stars, they whisper prayers to the god Enki, the Wise One, who dwells both in the deep waters below and in the heavens above. To them, these gods were not distant myths but tangible presences. When the wind shifted across the marshes, it was Enlil moving. When the rivers flooded, it was Enki's breath. When a king rose to power, it was because the Anunnaki had decreed it. And so, over centuries, the line between ruler and deity blurred. Kings began calling themselves chosen by the Anunnaki, sometimes even descended from them. The divine right to rule wasn't a metaphor. It was literal ancestry. Each new dynasty claimed blood that shimmered faintly with skyborn heritage. And through those claims, the myths became politics, and politics became religion. Civilization, in a sense, was built on the memory of the gods. What makes these stories so enduring isn't their grandeur, but their familiarity. The Sumerians didn't imagine flawless beings of pure light. Their gods quarrelled, loved, made mistakes, and demanded attention. They were as fallible as their creations. In that mirror, humanity found itself reflected. If the Anunnaki were the architects, they built not just bodies, but temperaments, restless, ambitious, emotional. In a strange way, the myth suggests that the gods made humans in their own image long before other religions would echo the same claim. Much later, when the tablets of Sumer were rediscovered in the 19th century, scholars began piecing together their fragments, translating the symbols, and realizing that many biblical stories had older versions here. The flood, the creation, the fall of man. They all began in these Mesopotamian tales. To many researchers, that was proof of cultural inheritance, not divine memory. To others, it hinted at something even more complex, that behind the myths might lie an encounter so ancient it blurred into legend. The notion that beings from the sky might have engineered or influenced early humanity isn't a new idea. It's a modern reimagining of what the Sumerians already believed. The difference is that today we have new vocabulary for it. Extraterrestrials instead of gods, technology instead of magic, DNA instead of divine essence. The language has changed, but the longing underneath it remains the same. Humans have always wanted to know where they come from, and the idea that someone, or something, designed us carries both comfort and unease. There's something haunting about how consistent these sky god myths are across continents. Civilizations that never met, separated by oceans, somehow describe visitors descending from above, teaching laws, astronomy, agriculture, and architecture. Coincidence, maybe? Or maybe it speaks to a shared human instinct to project the unknown upward, to imagine our teachers and makers among the stars. Still, when you trace those stories back, almost all roads lead to Sumer, The oldest scripts, the first records, the first names, they start there. What makes the Anunnaki narrative unique is its matter-of-fact tone. It doesn't read like worship, it reads like history, or at least what its authors thought of as history. Lists of kings include lines such as reigned when the gods themselves ruled the earth. The Sumerian king list even begins with a strange declaration. After the kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. Not metaphorically descended as though rulership itself was delivered from the sky like a torch. For many modern thinkers, that phrasing is irresistible. It invites speculation. If you look at it through the lens of myth, it's poetic. If you look through the lens of possibility, it's provocative. Could ancient humans have encountered something that inspired these tales? And if they did, would they not describe those beings as gods? But speculation isn't proof, and mystery doesn't always ask to be solved. Sometimes it's enough to listen to how people thousands of years ago tried to explain their world, to understand what it meant for them to believe that their origins were shared with the stars. Maybe the story of the Anunnaki endures because it captures something about our nature. The need to feel chosen, to imagine that consciousness wasn't an accident, to think that somewhere above someone cared enough to shape us. As the centuries passed, the gods of Sumer evolved. They were adopted, renamed, repurposed by Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. Anu remained the distant father of heaven. Enlil became the authority of wind and order. Enki turned into Ea, the clever engineer of creation. Their names changed, but their essence persisted, spreading outward like ripples through time. Every empire that rose in the Fertile Crescent built upon the bones of Sumer, and with them, the old stories found new voices. By the time writing spread westward, the myths had already matured into moral tales, but fragments of the original remained. The image of divine beings descending from above, the shaping of humankind, the conflict between creators, all of it echoed through the centuries. Even when new religions arrived and the old gods were buried under new scriptures, the Anunnaki lingered, hidden in margins and symbols, waiting to be rediscovered. Rediscovery came not through prophecy, but archaeology. When explorers unearthed the ruined libraries of Nineveh and Ur, they found tens of thousands of clay tablets. The language was dead, the script forgotten, but the stories were still there, pressed into mud by hands that had turned to dust millennia ago. Translators began their work piece by piece until a forgotten world came back to life. And as that world reappeared, so did its central mystery. Why did a civilization so ancient speak so confidently of gods who came from the sky, who built cities, and who, at least for a time, walked among humans? It's one thing to revere unseen deities. It's another to describe them as tangible rulers with addresses and family trees. Even now, scholars debate how literally these tales were meant to be taken. Were they symbolic, dramatizing natural forces like storm and river? Or did they record memories of something their authors genuinely believed had happened? The truth may be somewhere in between. Myths tend to mix the factual with the spiritual until both become inseparable. And maybe that's what makes them powerful. They carry truth not as data, but as feeling. When you think about it, every generation rewrites its own creation story. The Sumerians wrote of gods descending. Later cultures spoke of divine word and breath. Today we talk about evolution and molecules, yet in all versions the pattern is the same. Something greater shaping something smaller, the cosmos organizing itself into consciousness. Whether that something is divine, biological, or extraterrestrial almost doesn't matter. The story remains the same rhythm told in different languages. And so, as we move deeper into this tale of the Anunnaki, these skyborn teachers, rulers, or engineers, keep in mind that we're walking on both history and imagination. The tablets tell one side, the theories tell another. Somewhere between them lies the truth, or at least a truth worth listening to. The clay is waiting. The sky is watching. And the next part of this journey begins where those two meet, in the ancient tablets that first gave the Anunnaki their names, their faces, and their purpose. If you walk through the deserts of southern Iraq today, past the dust and quiet stretches of land where rivers once shimmered, it's hard to imagine that this was once the centre of the world. The wind moves low across the earth, whispering over broken bricks and pale shards of pottery, and in the heat the ground seems to breathe. Buried just beneath that cracked surface lies the memory of the first civilization humanity ever built. What remains of it isn't marble or gold, but clay. Thousands upon thousands of small rectangular tablets marked with the faint scars of a language that looks more like geometry than speech. That clay is where the story of the Anunnaki first took shape. Every mark pressed into those tablets was a decision, a sound turned into form. The Sumerians wrote with reeds, cutting the ends into wedges, pressing them into wet earth, and then baking the results in sunlight or fire. The process was slow, deliberate, and final. Once baked, the record would survive almost forever. That's why we still have them, because clay, though fragile in hand, is immortal against time. And those silent bricks covered in small triangles and lines hold what may be the oldest surviving attempt to describe the gods who made the world. It's easy to forget that before paper and printing, before alphabets and pens, knowledge was heavy. It had weight. To create a single record meant gathering clay, shaping it, writing carefully before it dried, and trusting that the gods themselves would protect it. So when someone sat down to write about the Anunnaki, they weren't just scribbling myth for entertainment. They were preserving what they believed to be the structure of reality. Some tablets were lists, kings, reigns, floods, genealogies of gods. Others were stories, long, detailed epics written in rhythmic prose, sometimes so complex that they had to be recited by temple priests trained for years. Among these was the Epic of Atrahasis, one of the oldest known tales of creation and flood. It describes how the gods, weary of labouring over the world themselves, decided to fashion humans to do the work. According to the text, the god Enki, wise and cunning, advised the others to use clay from the earth mixed with the blood of a slain god. From that mixture, humanity was born, part divine, part dust. It's an image that has echoed across millennia. Clay, blood, and breath, the elements of creation. You find them again in Genesis, in the Quran, in countless oral traditions. The details change, but the foundation remains. The idea that we were shaped, not born by chance, runs deep in our collective memory. And on those ancient tablets, that belief has been frozen in place for thousands of years. When modern archaeologists first uncovered these tablets in the 19th century, they didn't quite know what to make of them. The first discoveries came from excavations in places like Nineveh and Uruk, names that once sounded mythical, now proven real. Among the rubble of fallen palaces, explorers found whole libraries of clay, packed floor to ceiling. Many of these collections belonged to kings who saw themselves as keepers of wisdom. The most famous was Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian ruler who lived more than 2,000 years after the Sumerians. His library contained texts so old that even he had them copied from earlier originals. By the time his scribes etched the stories of the Anunnaki into new tablets, those myths were already ancient. Reading them was another challenge altogether. Cuneiform was a lost script, and deciphering it took decades of work. Scholars compared symbols across languages, pieced together sounds, and slowly began to hear voices that had been silent for 4,000 years. What they found stunned them. These weren't simple prayers or hymns. They were complex mythologies full of politics, family drama, and cosmic engineering. The Anunnaki were not ethereal spirits floating in clouds. They had ranks, duties, rivalries, and regions of control. Anu ruled the heavens. Enlil governed the air and earth's authority. Enki commanded the deep waters and wisdom. Inanna, fierce and bright, moved between realms of love and war. To the Sumerians, these were not abstract forces but personalities, fallible emotional, intelligent. They governed not just nature but society itself. Kings ruled by their mandate. Crops grew by their favour. Even death was described as a domain under their watch. What makes the clay records so remarkable is how detailed they are. The Sumerians didn't simply say, "The gods created mankind." They described the process like an engineer would outline a design. The mixing of substances, the shaping of form, the testing of results. Early humans, they said, were imperfect. Some couldn't speak, others couldn't stand upright. The gods adjusted their methods until they succeeded. To modern ears, it sounds almost scientific, like a forgotten prototype story. This detail is one reason why later writers like Zecharia Sitchin seized on the Anunnaki myths as potential evidence of ancient genetic engineering. He proposed that these sky gods weren't divine at all, but visitors from another world, advanced beings who modified early hominids to create the modern human species. His theories, though dismissed by mainstream academia, captured public imagination. Because the original tablets do leave just enough ambiguity to make you wonder what those early scribes thought they were describing. Was it a metaphor for the dawn of consciousness, or were they recording something they believed had physically happened? When you look closely at the tablets themselves, what's striking isn't just what they say, but how confidently they say it. There's no hesitation in the tone, no sense of exaggeration. To them, this was history. The Anunnaki were as real as kings and floods. They had temples, lineages, cities of their own. The texts describe their meetings, their councils, their arguments. It reads less like mythology and more like bureaucracy, divine minutes from a celestial government. Even the name Anunnaki carries structure. An means sky or heaven. Kai means earth. The suffix nena indicates descent or coming down. Literally those who from heaven to earth came. The phrase doesn't imply metaphor. It's directional, geographical, as if describing an arrival, a descent from above to below. To people living in a flat world under a glowing dome of stars, that descent wasn't impossible. It was expected. The gods lived up there. Why wouldn't they come down? Among the most famous of the texts mentioning the Anunnaki is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that evolved from earlier Sumerian sources. It describes how the universe began in watery chaos, how the gods emerged from the deep, and how they eventually organized the world. It also tells of rebellion among divine ranks, a war in heaven that mirrors human conflict on earth. The victors shaped order out of chaos, built the earth, and divided roles among themselves. Each god had a function, a domain. The Anunnaki oversaw the balance between the heavens and humanity. Reading these stories today, it's hard not to sense a strange familiarity. The hierarchies, the struggles for control, the stories of beings teaching mankind. It all echoes through later religions. The Sumerian pantheon may have been the prototype for the gods of Olympus, for the angels of Abrahamic faiths, for every tale of beings caught between divine and mortal worlds. That's what clay does. It holds continuity. It lets the first draft of civilization survive all the edits that came after. And yet, despite thousands of surviving tablets, we still don't have the full picture. For every text recovered, there are dozens lost. Fires, floods, and time itself erased most of what once existed. The stories we know are fragments, incomplete sentences broken by missing pieces. Entire sections end mid-thought, as if a scribe was interrupted mid-word 5,000 years ago, leaving silence that no one will ever fill. But even through those gaps, the sense of awe remains. If you were to hold one of those tablets in your hand, you'd feel its texture. Cool, rough, slightly uneven. The marks are shallow but precise, arranged in neat rows. Some still carry the fingerprints of the person who made them. Maybe that person was a priest, maybe a student, maybe someone recording taxes or temple offerings. But when it came to writing about the gods, that same hand carried the weight of eternity. There's something deeply human about that. The idea that someone sitting by a fire thousands of years ago thought to press their beliefs into earth so that others might one day understand. When archaeologists first realised that the Sumerians were older than Egypt, older than Greece, older even than the earliest dynasties of China, it reframed our sense of time. Civilization didn't start everywhere at once. It started here, in this basin between two rivers, and in that same soil where crops grew, myths took root. The Anunnaki weren't simply gods of harvest and sky. They were explanations for why humanity suddenly knew how to build, organise and imagine beyond survival. It's tempting to see this as coincidence, that the rise of writing and religion simply overlapped. But there's an argument to be made that the two are inseparable. Writing, after all, began as a religious act. The first tablets were not love letters or poems. They were inventory lists for temples, records of offerings to gods who needed precise management. That sense of record-keeping eventually expanded into storytelling, but its foundation remained the same, to communicate with the divine. The scribes who wrote about the Anunnaki weren't inventing gods, they were accounting for them. As centuries passed, these tablets multiplied, copied, translated, and carried into new kingdoms. The names changed, but the core idea endured. The gods descended, created, ruled, and then withdrew. In each retelling, humans stood between gratitude and rebellion, worship and independence. The pattern mirrored the relationship between teacher and student, parent and child. The Anunnaki, whether literal or symbolic, represented that moment when humanity first looked upward and thought, we were made for something. The more we uncover, the clearer it becomes that the clay wasn't just a medium for writing. It was the memory of civilization itself. Each line a bridge between worlds, each story a fragment of how people once understood the cosmos. The Sumerians believed that knowledge came from the heavens, but they also knew it had to be preserved on Earth. Without their careful work, without those humble tablets, the entire concept of recorded history might never have existed. Even now, new discoveries continue to appear. Excavations in Iraq and Syria occasionally reveal tablets that have lain untouched for thousands of years. Some are simple administrative notes, others fragments of epic poems. Each one adds a new detail to the portrait of the Anunnaki, a reminder that the story is still unfolding, and as we read them, we're not just learning about ancient gods. We're seeing the birth of something even more remarkable. Humanity's first attempt to understand itself through writing. So much of what we call mythology began as memory. Events softened by retelling, turned to symbols, reshaped by belief. The Anunnaki, whether real, divine or imagined, became the mould through which early humans defined power, creation and destiny. And even if they never existed beyond the tablets, their fingerprints remain in every later story that followed, the divine breath in clay, passed down through time. The next part of this story begins when those gods stop being distant names and start acting in the world. When temples rise, kings claim descent, and myths turn into cities. Because somewhere in that transition, the divine became political, and the Anunnaki began to rule not from the heavens, but from towers of stone and stairways reaching toward the stars. The world's first city didn't rise from ambition or conquest. It began, as most beginnings do, beside water. The Sumerians called it Eridu, a name that once meant something like home in the faraway. It sat near the coast of the Persian Gulf, where the Tigris and Euphrates once poured into marshland thick with reeds. Today that coastline has drifted far south, swallowed by centuries of silt and shifting earth. But in those early days the sea reached close enough for sailors to smell salt in the air. Eridu was small by our standards, a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounding a temple, yet in that modest sprawl something extraordinary happened. Humanity stopped wandering and began building permanence. For the Sumerians, Eridu wasn't just the first city, it was the first place. According to their own records, kingship itself descended from heaven there. That phrase appears again and again in the ancient texts, not invented, not discovered, but descended, as if authority were a physical thing dropped gently from the stars. The first king, Alulim, was said to have reigned in Eridu for thousands of years, his rule guided by the will of the gods. He was, by every account, chosen by the Anunnaki. Archaeologists digging at the site of Eridu found something remarkable, buried layer upon layer beneath the sand. 18 successive temples, each built directly atop the ruins of the last, stretching back over 1,000 years. At the base of those layers lies a small, simple shrine, a single-room structure with an altar. As centuries passed, each generation rebuilt the temple, enlarging it, adding walls, stairways, courtyards, until it became the towering ziggurat described in later eras. The pattern tells its own story. The people of Eridu never abandoned their gods. They simply kept building closer to them. To the Sumerians, the temple wasn't symbolic. It was a literal meeting point between heaven and earth, a place where divine and human boundaries overlapped. The god who presided over Eridu was Enki, the Wise One, master of fresh waters and hidden knowledge. His domain wasn't the sky, but the abyss, the Abzu, a vast underground ocean that the Sumerians believed fed the rivers and gave life to all things. In their cosmology, Enki's temple in Eridu stood at the mouth of that subterranean sea. To worship there was to stand on the edge of creation itself. Every morning priests climbed the steps of the temple with offerings of bread, beer and incense. They recited hymns written on clay tablets that praised Enki for bringing wisdom, irrigation and craftsmanship to mankind. The air must have smelled of smoke and river mud, the kind of mixture that lingers in memory. From the top of the temple, the city stretched out in organised rows, irrigation channels cutting through farmland, reed boats drifting along canals, markets opening as the sun rose. It was a scene both ordinary and sacred, a society built on the belief that the gods had walked here first. When you read the earliest Sumerian texts, the relationship between humans and gods feels less like worship and more like administration. The gods had specific territories, responsibilities, even work schedules. The people were expected to maintain order, provide offerings, and follow divine instructions handed down through priest kings. Eridu was the centre of that order, the cosmic headquarters, and at its heart was the temple of Enki, a place the texts call the House of the Water of Creation. If you imagine Eridu not as myth but as memory, it begins to look strangely deliberate. The architecture, the canals, the layout of temples, they were built with geometric precision. Scholars have long noted how Sumerian cities were aligned with cardinal directions and celestial patterns. The ziggurats often mirrored star constellations or solar paths. Some have wondered whether that alignment was purely religious, or if it served another purpose, a way to connect earthly design with whatever the Sumerians believed existed above them. The phrase, "as above, so below," might as well have been invented here. Over time, other cities rose, Uruk, Lagash, Ur, but the Sumerians always looked back to Eridu as the first. Their king lists describe how after each great flood or shift in power, kingship would descend from heaven again, sometimes in a new city but always in the same pattern. Eridu remained the sacred blueprint, the template for civilization itself. Every city that followed tried to recreate its relationship with the gods, to build stairways that could bridge the distance between heaven and earth. The Anunnaki were said to meet there, in council, under Enki's authority. These gatherings weren't depicted as ethereal assemblies of glowing light, but as structured meetings. The gods debated, made decisions, argued over who would rule which region, who would create or destroy. In one text, they even divide the world into zones of influence, assigning duties like administrators distributing provinces. It's bureaucratic, almost procedural, which is precisely why later generations found it so fascinating. These weren't untouchable cosmic forces. They were beings with plans, intentions, even disagreements. According to one account, Enki's wisdom extended beyond governance. He He was said to have taught humans language, writing, mathematics, and the arts of building. In some versions, he defied the will of other gods to protect humanity from destruction, instructing a chosen man, Atrahasis, to build a boat before a great flood. His temple in Eridu wasn't merely a place of prayer, it was described as a house of learning, a centre for divine instruction. You could call it the first university, where the subjects were law, astronomy, and creation itself. There's something haunting in the precision with which the Sumerians described their gods' activities. When modern researchers read these accounts, they're struck by how tangible everything sounds. The gods don't live in abstract heavens. They arrive in vehicles that shine, they settle in homes, they consume food and drink. Their cities are marked by towers and gardens, their dwellings described with architectural detail. Some modern theorists, especially those inspired by Sitchin's interpretations, suggest that the ziggurats, the stepped pyramids of Mesopotamia, might have served as symbolic or even practical landing platforms for these sky gods. The mainstream view dismisses this as fantasy, explaining the structures as elevated temples meant to bring priests closer to the heavens. But even if they were symbolic, that symbolism must have come from something powerful enough to persist through centuries of rebuilding. To walk through Eridu then would have felt like walking through a conversation between worlds. Every brick was placed with purpose. The Sumerians used baked clay, which meant every building glowed softly in sunlight. From a distance, the city might have looked golden, reflecting the same colour as the desert surrounding it. And yet inside those walls, life was simple. Farmers tending irrigation ditches, traders bringing goods from distant lands, artisans carving symbols of their gods. The boundary between sacred and ordinary life was almost invisible. Festivals in honour of the gods included not just prayers but music, feasts and dancing. The gods weren't distant overseers. They were participants in the rhythm of life. To honour Enki, people would pour water into canals, symbolically returning gifts to the deep. It was a world where divinity and humanity coexisted, where every task, from baking bread to building walls, carried cosmic weight. Eridu's influence spread far beyond its size. Its temple architecture became the model for later ziggurats. Its rituals shaped the foundation of Mesopotamian religion. Even after the city itself declined around 2000 BCE, its memory lingered. The Babylonians still spoke of it with reverence, calling it the city of the first kings. Later still, Jewish and Christian traditions would inherit fragments of its stories. The image of a divine garden, of rivers flowing from a sacred source, of humanity shaped from clay, all of it begins here. It's difficult to say exactly when the line between mythology and theology blurred. To the people of Eridu, there was no difference. The Anunnaki were real because their influence was everywhere. Their stories explained the order of the world. If crops failed, it was because the gods were displeased. If floods came, it was because balance had been disturbed. In that sense, the Anunnaki weren't just creators, they were constants, embedded into the very logic of existence. Yet even as the Sumerians recorded their devotion, traces of doubt appear. Some hymns praise the gods for their generosity, others plead with them to remember humanity's suffering. The people feared abandonment, the silence of heaven. They sensed that divine favour could vanish as easily as it appeared. That tension, the fear that the gods might leave, would become one of the great themes of later mythology. Modern scholars often debate why cities like Eridu collapsed. Climate change, shifting trade routes, political conflict, all likely played roles. But in Sumerian records, the explanation is always spiritual. When a city fell, it was because the gods withdrew their blessing. In some texts, they are described as literally departing, ascending back to the heavens. Whether that was metaphor or something more, it marked the end of an era. Humanity, it seemed, had to learn to rule itself. Still, Eridu never fully disappeared. Beneath the layers of later civilizations, its ruins remained a reminder of how everything began. To stand there today, among the dust and cracked clay, is to stand at the edge of memory. The ziggurat is gone, its bricks melted back into earth, but the foundation still whispers. Archaeologists have found offerings left behind by modern visitors, small stones, coins, even written prayers. People still feel drawn to that place, though they may not know why. Perhaps it's because Eridu represents something universal, the moment humanity stopped being a creature of the wild and became a maker of worlds. The first act of faith wasn't building a temple to the gods, it was believing that the gods would visit. That belief made civilization possible. It gave order to chaos, purpose to labour, meaning to time. The Anunnaki, real or not, became the scaffolding on which early humans built the idea of destiny. In the centuries after Eridu's rise, new cities took its place. Uruk, with its massive walls and temples to Inanna, and Ur, with its royal tombs gleaming in the desert sun. Each one claimed its own divine patrons, but they all traced their lineage back to that first settlement by the sea. The gods had walked there, kings had ruled by their decree. And somewhere in that shared memory, the idea of humanity's divine ancestry took root. When you look at Eridu through the eyes of history, it's just ruins, ancient foundations swallowed by sand. But through the eyes of the Sumerians, it was proof that the line between human and divine had once been thin enough to cross. The city was a bridge, and the Anunnaki were its builders. Everything that came after, religion, monarchy, science, philosophy, stands on the foundation they laid. The story doesn't end there, of course. Eridu may have been the beginning, but the descent of the gods didn't stop with a single city. As humanity spread, so did the stories of their celestial teachers, each culture adding new layers to the same mystery. The next part of this journey follows those visitors themselves, the ones who, according to legend, stepped down from the heavens to walk among men. If you imagine the world as the Sumerians once saw it, you'd picture a flat land beneath an endless sky, a dome of stars that curved so low it felt almost within reach. There were no satellites then, no planes, nothing man-made to interrupt that silent horizon. The sky wasn't an expanse of cold physics. It was a living space full of movement and presence. Every wandering light was a traveller, every streak of fire a message. When the people looked up, they didn't see emptiness. They saw roads of the gods, and from those roads they believed the Anunnaki descended. The earliest stories don't describe this descent as metaphor or dream. They treat it like an event, an act of geography. The sky and the earth were connected by what they called the Duranki, the bond between heaven and ground. Through this channel, divine beings could move freely between worlds. In the oldest myths, the Anunnaki weren't distant watchers. They came down to rule, to instruct, and sometimes to interfere. They didn't remain untouchable, glowing in clouds of myth. They walked the same dust as humans, leaving footprints near rivers that still exist today. One of the most detailed accounts of their descent comes from the Sumerian myth known as the Enki and the World Order. It describes how Enki, Lord of Wisdom, travelled across the lands, organising creation. He divided the regions, assigned duties to the other gods, and established the laws of civilization. The text lists specific cities, landscapes, and professions: scribes, weavers, metalworkers, all said to have been given their purpose by divine decree. It doesn't read like an abstract poem. It reads like a record of administration, as if the gods arrived not just to rule but to implement a plan. When you think about that, it feels oddly familiar. The idea of a group descending from above, dividing responsibilities, teaching crafts. It mirrors the structure of an expedition. Some modern researchers, particularly those intrigued by ancient astronaut theories, see in these descriptions a primitive record of contact. The shining crafts of the gods, the thunder of their arrival, their radiant clothing. All these could be the vocabulary of a culture trying to describe advanced technology. But to the Sumerians, there was nothing mechanical about it. These were acts of creation. To them, light itself was divine. The Anunnaki, according to the myths, didn't appear all at once. They arrived in stages, generations of gods, each with their own purpose. Anu remained in the heavens, the distant patriarch. His children and subordinates came down to shape the world. Among them was Enlil, who governed the air and enforced divine law, and Enki, who shaped the living. Others followed. Ninhursag, the lady of the mountains and mother of all life, and Inanna, whose presence would later transform myth entirely. Each one brought something specific to humanity, as if each visit carried a lesson. The texts describe these beings as radiant and powerful, but not immortal in the way later religions would imagine gods. They could tire, quarrel, even suffer. They lived for what seemed like vast spans of time, measured in thousands of human years, but they had beginnings and endings. In one myth, they complain of fatigue, saying the labour of maintaining the world is too great. It's this exhaustion that leads to the creation of humans, to bear the burden of work that the gods themselves no longer wish to carry. That detail always catches attention. Gods who grow weary sound remarkably human. There's another layer to the story, though, one that often gets overlooked. The Anunnaki didn't just descend to rule, they intermingled. The texts speak of unions between gods and humans, producing semi-divine offspring, kings who carried both mortal and celestial blood. This isn't unique to Sumer. You find the same theme later in Greece, Egypt, even the Old Testament. But Sumerian records describe it with unusual clarity, even listing lineages that trace back to those unions. For the Sumerians, divine ancestry wasn't metaphorical. It was the foundation of kingship. To rule meant to possess the blood of heaven. When you trace the details across tablets, you see a recurring pattern. The Anunnaki arrive, establish order, teach humanity, and then withdraw. Sometimes they leave by choice, other times after conflict among themselves. Their departure always marks the beginning of decline, as if civilization can only thrive when it is supervised. It's a cycle of descent, instruction, and absence. Every later culture repeats it, changing names but not structure. In the myth of Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, the story goes even further. Enmerkar, one of the earliest kings of Uruk, sends a message to a distant land said to be rich in gold and lapis lazuli. Arata, the city blessed by Inanna herself. He demands tribute and threatens divine punishment if refused. But the text doesn't just tell of war and trade. It contains a curious passage describing a time before the languages of the world were divided, when all people spoke one tongue and lived in harmony. That unity, the myth says, was broken by the will of the gods. It's an uncanny parallel to the story of Bebel written centuries later. The memory of divine descent, of intervention that shaped human destiny, seems to echo through every retelling. Archaeologists, for their part, have unearthed traces of Eridu, Uruk and other Sumerian cities, finding the remains of temples, canals and palaces. What they haven't found, of course, is physical evidence of skyborn beings. The consensus is that the Anunnaki were symbolic, the embodiment of natural forces, deified ancestors, or personifications of societal order. But what makes the discussion interesting isn't evidence, it's consistency. For thousands of years, the story of gods descending from the heavens has persisted in every corner of the world. Either humans are unimaginably consistent in their inventions, or they were recording something they all experienced in some way. Descriptions of the Anunnaki often mention brightness, faces that shine like the sun, voices that shake the mountains. The tablets refer to skyboats, or chariots of fire that carry the gods between realms. In context, these may simply be poetic ways of describing storms or meteors, but they could also be the ancient vocabulary for something seen but not understood. When a culture without machines witnesses light crossing the sky, what else could they call it but divine? If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the later Mesopotamian texts, you'll notice how the gods interact with humans in direct physical ways. They send storms, they meet travellers, they appear in dreams. Gilgamesh himself is said to be 2/3 divine, born of a union between mortal and Anunnaki blood. His journey isn't only about mortality, it's about trying to reconnect with his celestial origins. That theme, the longing to return to the source, may be the oldest human story there is. The Sumerians didn't just write these tales for entertainment. Myths were part of their education, their legal systems, their sense of identity. Each temple kept its own version, slightly different but always tied to the idea of descent. The gods had come once, therefore everything humans built was a continuation of that first divine project. Knowledge wasn't discovered, it was inherited. Wisdom wasn't invented, it was remembered. It's striking how pragmatic the Sumerians were about their gods. There was no blind mysticism, no demand for faith as later religions would define it. Their relationship with the Anunnaki was transactional. Humans offered food, prayer, and maintenance of temples, and in return, the gods ensured fertility, order, and protection. The system functioned like an agreement between partners, and perhaps that's what made it sustainable for so long. It was balanced, not purely devotional. Over time, as Sumerian culture spread into Akkad and Babylon, the stories changed shape. The Anunnaki became a collective term for all deities of the underworld, while a new group, the Igigi, were described as young gods who served the higher ones. In one myth, the Igigi rebel against their labour, prompting the creation of mankind. The pattern repeats. The powerful create the lesser to serve them, the lesser seek freedom, the cycle begins again. It's as if the human struggle for autonomy was embedded in our mythology from the start. Modern theories, especially those blending archaeology with speculative science, have tried to map these myths onto real timelines. They suggest that if the Anunnaki were visitors, their arrival might correspond to sudden leaps in early human development, the emergence of agriculture, architecture, and astronomy. Skeptics counter that such leaps were natural outcomes of social evolution. But even skeptics admit that Sumer's rise was unusually rapid. In less than a millennium, a collection of small settlements became a network of cities with codified law, written language, and mathematical systems that still define our calendars today. Whether guided by gods or genius, it was an acceleration unlike any before it. The descent of the Anunnaki, then, can be read in two ways. One, as literal, the intervention of beings from the sky shaping the path of civilization. Or two, as symbolic, the awakening of human intellect, the moment consciousness looked upward and called its own ideas divine. Both interpretations lead to the same truth. Something extraordinary happened, and humanity has been telling that story ever since. When the Sumerians spoke of their gods departing, they didn't describe disappearance as much as retreat. The Anunnaki withdrew to the heavens, leaving humanity to govern itself. But they didn't abandon the world entirely. The texts say they continued to watch, to send dreams, to whisper through omens. In times of crisis, they returned briefly, storms of fire, voices in thunder. The connection between heaven and earth was never severed, only quieted. That image of distant watchers who once walked among us has never faded. It resurfaces in every age, reinterpreted through new language. Angels descending in light, star beings visiting in craft, ancestors arriving from distant constellations. It's the same melody played in different keys. Each retelling reminds us of that first descent, when the boundary between sky and soil was porous. Archaeologists will tell you that Eridu and Uruk were the birthplaces of urban life. But to the Sumerians, those cities were the footprints of gods. The Anunnaki didn't just teach them how to build, they showed them where to build. Every ziggurat, every temple was placed according to celestial alignment, echoing the stars they believed their creators came from. Even today, the ruins still reflect those patterns, as if the earth itself remembers the instructions. The descent of the gods wasn't just a story about power, it was about connection. The Sumerians saw themselves as partners in a divine project. They built temples not to trap the gods, but to give them a home when they returned. Each festival, each offering was a rehearsal for reunion, and that longing, that readiness, might be the most human part of the story. Because even now, thousands of years later, we still look up at the sky and wait for something to come down. The Anunnaki, whether they were cosmic engineers or mythic reflections of our own imagination, left behind a legacy stronger than stone. They gave humanity its first sense of continuity between earth and heaven, its first vision of purpose beyond survival. They taught that the world wasn't random, that order could be built, that meaning could descend from above and be shaped by hands of clay. As time passed and empires rose over Sumer's old lands, the stories changed. The names shifted into Akkadian, then Babylonian, then Hebrew and Greek. But beneath those translations, the same framework endured. The sky gave life, the gods came down, humans inherited their image. What began as the descent of the Anunnaki became the foundation for every theology that followed. And as the myths expanded, so did the questions. If the gods once descended to shape mankind, why did they leave? Where did they go? The next part of this story leads directly into that mystery. The creation of humans, their purpose, and the moment when the hands of the gods touched the clay of the earth and moulded something that could think, dream, and remember. The Sumerians believed the gods made us from the soil they walked upon, not metaphorically, not as poetry, but literally. According to the oldest tablets, there came a time when the Anunnaki grew weary of their labour. They had shaped the world, arranged its waters, marked its seasons, and built the foundations of their own temples. But work remained. Fields to tend, canals to dig, offerings to prepare, and the gods, though powerful, were not above exhaustion. They gathered in council and decided something had to change. The world needed caretakers. Enki, the wise one of Eridu, was the first to speak of a solution. He proposed creating a new being, one that could think, speak, and work, yet remain devoted to its makers. His idea was bold and dangerous, for to shape life was to trespass on the boundary between creator and creation. But the others agreed. They chose to craft a creature from the same substance that formed the earth itself. In Sumerian language, that substance was Adama, clay, the red-brown flesh of the ground. The story begins not with lightning or divine proclamation, but with quiet labour. The gods gathered clay from the banks of the Euphrates. They mixed it with water from the Abzu, the subterranean ocean where Enki dwelled. To this mixture they added the essence of the divine. Some texts say the blood of a slain god, others speak of a spark or breath. The tablets describe the process with eerie precision. Clay moulded, shaped by hand, infused with life. The first human, they say, opened his eyes and breathed. It's strange how familiar that sounds. Thousands of years later, the same sequence appears in other traditions. Dust, breath, awakening. The Bible would say, "The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life." The Sumerians said it first, with fewer metaphors. To them, breath wasn't just animation, it was partnership. The human was a bridge between the living earth and the living heavens. The myth continues with a curious detail. The first humans were imperfect. Some couldn't stand upright, others couldn't speak, others lacked strength. The gods adjusted their design, remoulding and refining. It's a small line on a cracked tablet, but it suggests something remarkable. The idea of trial and error, of experimentation. Creation wasn't a single act, it was a process. Humanity, in this telling, wasn't the perfect image of the divine, but the result of learning. When the gods were satisfied, they set the new beings to work. The humans cultivated fields, built temples, and carried offerings. The texts describe this not as servitude, but as a partnership. The gods provided wisdom and abundance, and humans maintained order on earth. It was a balance, delicate but peaceful. For a time, all was well. The gods rested, the humans laboured, and civilization began to spread along the rivers. Then came noise. That's how the myth puts it. The noise of humanity grew too great. The gods, disturbed from their rest, complained. They gathered again, debating what to do. Enlil, the stern enforcer of order, wanted silence. Enki, ever the protector of humankind, argued for mercy. The stories differ on how the argument ended, but the theme repeats through later myths. A flood, a cleansing, a reset. Humanity, it seems, was both blessing and burden to its creators. If you read these tablets without preconception, they don't feel like fantasy. They feel like recollection, as if the Sumerians were describing something remembered, not imagined. The language is too detailed, the tone too practical. It's not the poetry of dreamers, it's the record of witnesses. Whether those witnesses saw gods, teachers, or something else entirely, we can't know. But they believed it enough to press it into clay for eternity. Enki's role in these stories is always the same: mediator, scientist, protector. He is the one who brings life from water, who solves the dilemmas of creation, who teaches humans how to survive. In some versions, he moulds both male and female from the same clay. In others, he consults with Ninhursag, the mother goddess, whose hands complete the shaping. Together, they form the human body, and Ninhursag utters the first words of compassion recorded in human history. "My hands have made it. My heart rejoices." That line is carved into a tablet found at Nippur, one of the oldest surviving cities in the world. It's faded and incomplete, but enough remains to feel its warmth. For all the cosmic grandeur of the Anunnaki myths, moments like that make them intimate. They're not just about gods and stars, they're about hands in clay, about care, about the quiet satisfaction of creation. When modern scholars first translated these passages, they were astonished by their familiarity. They saw in them the prototypes of later creation stories: divine breath, sacred clay, the fall of favour, the flood. Some dismissed the parallels as coincidence. Others saw them as lineage, the migration of myth through cultures. Either way, the Sumerian version remains the oldest. It's where the archetype began. What's fascinating is how the Sumerians themselves interpreted this relationship. They didn't see humans as slaves or accidents. They believed their purpose was sacred work, maintaining the order the gods had established. Every harvest, every offering, every act of craftsmanship was part of that original agreement. Humanity wasn't meant to dominate the earth, but to keep it balanced. The word they used for to serve also meant to care for. That balance defined their world. The gods ruled from their temples, but those temples were managed by humans. Every structure in Sumer was a reflection of that partnership. The ziggurat, the stepped pyramid that reached toward the heavens, wasn't just a monument. It was a ladder of communication. The gods could descend, the priests could ascend. The space between them was filled with ritual, the language of connection. Some scholars interpret the creation myth as an allegory for humanity's awakening from instinct to reason. The moment the gods gave life to clay might represent the birth of consciousness, the spark of self-awareness that separated humans from the animals around them. Others, following Sitchin's line of thought, suggest it could describe something more literal, an early record of genetic intervention, the merging of earthly biology with something otherworldly. Whether symbolic or speculative, the idea remains the same. Humanity didn't just evolve, it was activated. In that light, Enki becomes more than a mythic figure. He becomes the archetype of the teacher, the engineer, the one who defies authority to protect creation. Even in later Babylonian and Akkadian retellings, he remains the same: clever, compassionate, endlessly curious. It's no wonder his temple at Eridu was called the House of Wisdom. People prayed there not only for forgiveness but for understanding. The Sumerian language has a word, ti, which means both life and rib. In one version of the creation story, Ninhursag uses Enki's rib to heal him after he falls ill. The wordplay is strikingly similar to the later Hebrew tale of Eve's creation from Adam's rib. These echoes aren't random. They show how stories travel, how ideas of origin migrate from one tongue to another. The Sumerian myth may not be identical to the ones that followed, but its rhythm is unmistakable. The clay, the breath, the shaping hand, it's all there, thousands of years before Genesis was ever written. For the Sumerians, the act of creation wasn't just divine privilege. It was a template for human creativity. To make anything, a pot, a wall, a law, was to imitate the gods. Every craft was sacred, every artist a reflection of Enki's first act. That's why Sumerian culture valued artisans so highly. Their work wasn't decoration, it was continuity. Each time they moulded clay, they reenacted the making of humanity. There's a quiet reverence in that idea, the notion that to create is to participate in something eternal, that every tool, every building, every written word carries the same gesture as the divine hand that shaped the first human. In that sense, the Anunnaki myth is less about servitude and more about inheritance. We were made to build, to learn, to sustain. The gods, in creating us, passed on their own creative impulse. But myths evolve with time, and so did this one. Later tablets describe how humans multiplied, filled the earth, and grew restless. They forgot their place in the balance. The gods, irritated, withdrew further from daily life. The partnership fractured. It's a melancholy shift, the moment when the world stopped being shared and became divided. The Sumerians might not have called it a fall, but they felt the loss of closeness all the same. In that gap, new questions arose. If the gods had shaped us, could we ever reach them again? Could we recreate what they had done? The priests of Nippur and Eridu pondered this as they observed the heavens. Their temples became laboratories of thought. Astronomy, mathematics, and medicine grew from the desire to understand divine processes. The pursuit of knowledge was an act of devotion, a way to trace the footsteps of the creators. When you look at it that way, the Sumerian story isn't primitive at all. It's the foundation of everything we now call civilization. The idea that humans are capable of shaping their world, that knowledge is sacred, that creation has purpose, all of it begins here. The clay and breath of those myths aren't just metaphors for flesh and life. They're blueprints for consciousness. Even after Sumer faded, the image of divine artisans shaping humanity endured. In Egypt, the god Khnum moulded humans on a potter's wheel. In Greece, Prometheus sculpted them from earth and gave them fire. In the Old Testament, God formed Adam from dust and breathed life into him. The materials change slightly, but the act remains identical. Somewhere deep in our shared memory, the idea persists that we began in the hands of something greater. To hold that thought isn't superstition, it's recognition. Our bodies are earth, water, and breath. Whether one believes in divine creation or natural evolution, the composition is the same. We are made of the same dust that built stars, the same elements that formed the first rivers of Eridu. The Sumerians, without modern science, understood that connection instinctively. To them, clay wasn't a symbol, it was truth. Every creation myth says more about its people than its gods. The Sumerians, surrounded by fertile mud, saw the earth itself as sacred. Their gods didn't create from nothing, they shaped what already existed. That subtle difference matters. It means creation wasn't about domination, but transformation. The gods didn't summon the world into being, they collaborated with it. And perhaps that's the oldest wisdom of all, that life doesn't appear out of command, but cooperation. As the myth closes, the newly made humans gather in the fields. They till the soil, build canals, and offer thanks to Enki and Ninhursag. The gods watch, satisfied. The world is balanced, alive, self-sustaining. Civilization has begun. Yet in the background, the wind carries a question, unspoken but inevitable. How long would the peace last? Because stories, like civilizations, never stay still. And the next one that rose from Sumer's clay would carry familiar echoes. A garden, a river, a pair of humans walking among divine presences. A paradise before exile, a memory older than Eden itself. If you trace every paradise story backward far enough, past the layers of scripture and translation, Past the metaphors and moral lessons, you find yourself standing once again in Sumer. The concept of a perfect garden where divine and mortal once lived together doesn't begin in Genesis. It begins beside the slow rivers of Mesopotamia, in a place the Sumerians called Dilmun. It was described not as myth, but as geography, a real region, radiant and fertile, where sickness did not exist and gods walked openly among their creations. The later religions would rename it Eden, but long before those words were written, Dilmun was already considered the home of the immortals. In the oldest Sumerian poem, Enki and Ninhursag, the story of this garden begins quietly. Dilmun is pure, untouched by decay. Its rivers flow sweetly, its trees bear fruit without effort, its animals do not prey upon one another. There is no aging, no death, no pain. The gods dwell there in harmony, and Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, finds joy in its perfection. The text describes the land as bright, a word that appears again and again in Mesopotamian myths to signify the presence of the divine. Everything that shines is sacred. But as in all such stories, perfection doesn't last. Enki, ever curious, explores the garden's boundaries and encounters Ninhursag, the mother goddess. Their union brings forth the first plants and flowers of the world, each one born of divine contact. The poem then turns strange and intimate. Enki eats the sacred plants, absorbing their essence, and becomes ill. Ninhursag, angered, curses him and disappears, leaving the world without her healing power. Only when she returns and heals Enki by creating deities from his ailing organs, one for each part of the body, does balance return. This tale, odd and detailed as it is, carries the structure that will echo across later faiths. A sacred garden, divine union, forbidden act, loss of harmony, and restoration. Yet here, in its earliest form, the story isn't about disobedience or punishment. It's about curiosity and consequence, about how knowledge transforms innocence into awareness. Enki's act of tasting the sacred plants isn't rebellion, it's discovery. And in that discovery, the world becomes more complex. When the ancient scribes wrote of Dilmun, they weren't imagining paradise beyond reach. They thought it existed somewhere near the mouth of the Persian Gulf, where freshwater springs bubbled into the sea. Archaeologists believe they may have been describing Bahrain or nearby islands, fertile oases amid the desert. To the Sumerians, such a place would have felt divine. Endless water, green palms, life in abundance. Dilmun was both real and spiritual, a borderland between heaven and earth. What's remarkable is how this idea migrated almost unchanged through centuries. When the Hebrew writers composed Genesis, they placed Eden at the source of 4 rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, Pishon, and Gihon. 2 of those are unmistakably Mesopotamian. The imagery of a god walking in a garden at twilight, of rivers feeding creation, of humans formed from earth, all of it has Sumerian roots. The Bible's Eden, stripped of its local names and turned into moral allegory, still carries the soil of Dilmun. In the Sumerian view, the gods and humans weren't yet separated in those early days. They worked together, shared meals, and exchanged knowledge. The temple was an extension of the divine garden, a place where the abundance of Dilmun was recreated on earth. Each ziggurat, each walled courtyard filled with palms and pools, was a microcosm of that perfect land. Worship wasn't about escape to heaven. It was about bringing heaven here. Over time, as the myths evolved, Dilmun became more distant, both physically and spiritually. It shifted from an earthly paradise to a divine dwelling. The gods withdrew, and humans were left outside the gates. The Sumerians expressed this transition not through sin, but through loss of connection. The bridge between realms weakened. The rivers still flowed, but their source, the deep divine waters of the Abzu, became harder to reach. In the poem The Journey of Enki's Messenger, There's a passage describing the road to Dilmun as guarded, accessible only to those granted permission by the gods. The journey isn't described as impossible, just restricted. Humanity, once welcome, now had to earn entry. That subtle change marks one of the earliest expressions of spiritual exile. Not punishment, just distance. The world hadn't fallen, it had shifted. If you look at these myths side by side, you start to see how the Garden of Eden is less an original story than an echo of an older one. The Sumerians didn't invent the idea of paradise. They recorded what they thought was memory. A time when the earth itself was pure, and the boundary between mortal and divine was open. They weren't nostalgic for perfection. They were trying to preserve the knowledge of it. The image of Enki and Ninhursag standing beside rivers and shaping life from clay and water feels deeply human. It's not about miracles. It's about creation through touch, through work. Their paradise wasn't one of idleness, but of harmony. The world was ordered. Every living thing had purpose. When Enki's curiosity disrupted that balance, it didn't destroy the garden, it changed it. The myth suggests that growth requires imperfection, that knowledge and creation are inseparable from error. That idea of wisdom born from transgression would repeat endlessly. In Eden, it becomes the fruit of knowledge. In Greek myth, it's Prometheus stealing fire. In every version, enlightenment comes at a cost. But in Sumer, that cost isn't eternal punishment. It's the beginning of civilization. When Enki ate the sacred plants, the gods learned healing. When humans sought knowledge, they built cities. The act that breaks paradise also builds the world. There's something profoundly modern about that. The Sumerians weren't moralizing, they were observing. They saw progress and loss as two sides of the same act. The first humans may have lived close to the gods, but ignorance kept them dependent. Once they learned to think, to question, to create, they became independent, and in doing so they moved away from divine simplicity. The garden didn't vanish. Humanity simply walked out of it, one discovery at a time. Archaeological finds from ancient temples support how central the garden idea was to Sumerian life. Carvings depict flowing streams, trees heavy with fruit, and figures carrying baskets of offerings. These aren't scenes of afterlife reward, but everyday abundance. To them, paradise wasn't waiting beyond death. It was a condition of balance between humans, gods, and nature. When that balance faltered, through neglect, war, or greed, the garden faded. When restored, it bloomed again. Inscriptions from Eridu and Uruk describe priests tending temple gardens with sacred precision. Each plant had a purpose, each canal a symbolic alignment with the cosmic order. The act of watering the garden was a reenactment of Enki's gift of life-giving waters. Even the Sumerian word for temple, also meant house. Their gods weren't remote beings on mountaintops. They were residents of carefully cultivated spaces. The divine was domestic, tangible. When the later Babylonians inherited these stories, they added a layer of melancholy. Dilmun became a place no longer accessible, hidden beyond the seas. The gods still visited, but humans could not follow. It was said that only those favoured by the gods might catch a glimpse of it in dreams. This is where paradise begins to shift from geography to symbol. What was once a physical land becomes a spiritual ideal, a memory of unity humanity can't quite return to. Yet traces of it lingered everywhere. The layout of Sumerian cities, with their central temples surrounded by canals and gardens, mirrored the image of paradise on earth. The word Eden itself likely comes from the Sumerian Eden, meaning plain or steppe. The biblical Eden, therefore, is literally the plain, a reference to the fertile lands of Mesopotamia. When later writers placed the Garden of Eden eastward, they weren't imagining an abstract heaven. They were pointing directly toward the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. It's difficult to overstate how deeply this connection runs. The creation of humans from clay, the rivers flowing through paradise, the The divine garden lost to distance. It's all Sumerian. Even the serpent, though absent in the earliest Dilmun texts, appears later as a symbol of renewal and wisdom in Mesopotamian iconography. The Tree of Life, central to so many traditions, originates in Sumerian carvings showing two deities flanking a sacred tree, hands extended as if drawing power from its branches. That image would travel through Babylon, Assyria, and eventually into biblical art. The roots of Eden quite literally are planted in Mesopotamian soil. But if Dilmun was the first paradise, it was also the first lesson in impermanence. The gods' garden didn't last forever, and neither did their nearness. The Sumerians knew that every order eventually dissolves into chaos, that balance requires constant renewal. Their myths didn't promise eternal perfection, they promised cycles. Creation, harmony, disruption, restoration. Each generation reenacted the pattern. Each ritual, each festival, was an attempt to bring the garden back, if only for a while. That's what makes their worldview so human. They didn't seek escape from the world, they sought to repair it. When floods came, they rebuilt. When the gods seemed silent, they called to them through song. Even when the land turned dry and cities fell, they believed the divine rivers still flowed somewhere beneath the earth, waiting to rise again. Paradise wasn't lost, it was sleeping. If you walk today among the ruins of Eridu or Uruk, the earth still carries that memory. Beneath the dust lie remnants of courtyards once filled with water and shade, bricks once painted blue to mimic the colour of the Abzu. The air hums with the ghosts of irrigation channels, the first human-made veins of life. In those ruins, the myth and the world touch each other. The garden isn't gone, it's buried, like memory itself. The transition from Dilmun to Eden marks more than the evolution of a story. It marks the evolution of self-awareness. The moment humanity began to tell its own version of divine memory, to question its origins, to wonder what it means to live outside perfection. In that way, every retelling of the garden myth is an act of remembrance. We aren't just imagining paradise, we're trying to recall it. And so, the garden before Eden stands as the blueprint of all creation myths that followed, a land of rivers and divine companionship, where curiosity first met consequence, where the gods and their creations shared the same soil. It was the place where clay learned to breathe, where the world learned to grow, and where humanity first understood that beauty and fragility are the same thing. From that moment on, the stories of the gods and humans would no longer unfold in gardens, but in cities, temples, and battles. The divine order would drift further away, and the longing for it would only deepen. The Anunnaki, once neighbours, would become legends, and humanity, carrying their image, would begin the long journey from paradise toward its own kind of creation, civilization. When the gods withdrew from the garden and the rivers no longer spoke, the world changed shape. The harmony of creation became hierarchy. What had once been shared between gods and humans turned into order and rank. The stories began to speak not of walking beside the divine, but of serving it. The Sumerians were the first to record that shift, the moment when heaven became authority and earth became responsibility, and at the heart of it stood the kings. The earliest tablets from Eridu and Uruk don't describe kings as rulers in the modern sense. They were caretakers, chosen not by vote or conquest, but by decree from the heavens. The Sumerian king list, etched carefully into clay around 4,000 years ago, opens with a simple line: "When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu." That phrase repeats like a refrain through their history. Each new dynasty, each new city-state, begins with the same event. Kingship descends, and a new world order begins. It was never seized, it was given. To rule was to serve. The Sumerians believed that kings existed not to dominate, but to maintain the balance the gods had established. They called their rulers Lugal, meaning big man, but the title carried weight beyond power. A Lugal was a mediator between worlds, responsible for ensuring that offerings reached the gods and blessings flowed back to the people. He was both priest and administrator, both servant and symbol. The first of these, according to their records, was Alulim of Eridu. His reign lasted 28,000 years, if we trust the king list, though the number was never meant to be literal. It represented divine measure, an age beyond time, an era when kings still carried fragments of the god's lifespan. These mythic reigns gradually shortened as the list continues, as if each generation moved further from the divine source. By the time history becomes verifiable, human reigns have shrunk to decades. The immortality of heaven had thinned into the mortality of men. But the authority remained sacred. To disobey a king was to disrupt cosmic order. In Sumerian theology, the hierarchy of heaven was mirrored exactly on earth. Anu ruled the sky, Enlil governed the air, Enki the waters, and beneath them were ranks of lesser gods. So too were kings surrounded by nobles, priests and officials, each one a reflection of divine structure. Society wasn't invented, it was imitated. In the great cities that followed, Ur, Lagash, Kish, and Uruk, temples dominated skylines. They weren't built for spectacle, but as proof of allegiance. Each temple was a throne for its patron god, each king a steward tending to that throne. Festivals, harvests, and laws revolved around divine cycles. The king's role was to interpret the will of heaven to ensure that time itself flowed correctly. That's why early kings often called themselves shepherds. They didn't own their people, they guided them. Still, power has gravity. Over time, the balance between service and supremacy began to tilt. Kings who once bowed before the gods began to imagine themselves as divine. It started subtly, in titles, in rituals, in architecture. In Uruk, the priest-king wore a horned crown, symbol of the gods. In later dynasties, rulers like Naram-Sin of Akkad would declare themselves god of Akkad, carving their names beside the stars. The divine mandate slowly became divine identity. That transformation is written in stone. On the stele of Naram-Sin, a relic over 4,000 years old, the king is shown climbing a mountain, surrounded by soldiers, trampling his enemies. Above him, the sun and stars shine, symbols of the heavens acknowledging his ascent. It's not humility carved there, it's ambition. The gods no longer descend, the king ascends. The direction of divinity has reversed. But even as kings rose toward the heavens, the old idea of service remained underneath. The rituals of offering continued, the festivals of renewal repeated year after year. Each spring, the city of Ur held a ceremony known as the Sacred Marriage. The king, acting as the embodiment of Dumuzi, the shepherd god, would ritually unite with a priestess representing Inanna, goddess of love and fertility. Their symbolic union ensured prosperity for the land. It was a reenactment of divine balance, a reminder that power without devotion leads to decay. In the mythic imagination of Sumer, every kingdom existed under the eyes of the Anunnaki. The stars were not distant suns, they were the thrones of gods. The constellations mapped their order, their movements dictating seasons and omens. Astronomy wasn't a separate science. It was theology made visible. To chart the sky was to read the intentions of heaven. The Sumerians called the Milky Way the river of the gods, believing the souls of kings travelled along it after death. The same stars that marked planting and harvest also marked destiny. Their knowledge of the sky was astonishing. They tracked the paths of Jupiter, Venus and Mars with accuracy that modern historians still admire. They recognized the lunar cycle's effect on tides and timekeeping. Their priests became early astronomers, not out of curiosity but out of necessity. The heavens were the schedule of the gods, and the king had to follow it precisely. To misread a star was to risk disorder. Through that lens, kingship was as much an act of faith as governance. The king's duty wasn't only to rule his people, but to interpret the stars, to align human activity with cosmic law. In temple archives, Clay tablets record observations of eclipses, comets, and conjunctions, each one accompanied by predictions of fortune or disaster. A sudden darkening of the moon might signify the displeasure of Enlil. A bright morning star might herald victory. The king's advisors, the Baru, or diviners, translated those signs into policy. Heaven's light became the empire's rule book. There's a quiet irony in that system. The gods had made humans to labour, yet now humanity's greatest minds laboured to understand the gods. The order had inverted. Knowledge flowed upward instead of downward. The Sumerians may not have seen it that way, but from a distance it looks like evolution. The moment when humanity began to manage its own destiny by studying the very heavens that once dictated it. Still, the kings never claimed independence. Their legitimacy always depended on divine approval. When wars broke out, the first step wasn't to gather armies, it was to consult the oracles. If the omens were unfavourable, even the most ambitious rulers delayed their campaigns. Power in Sumer was always borrowed. The gods could revoke it at any moment. Floods, droughts, and invasions were seen as reminders of that truth. When Akkad fell, the poets wrote that Enlil had turned his face away. When Ur collapsed centuries later, they said the gods had abandoned their temples. No empire fell by human hands alone. It was always the heavens that decided. The relationship between gods and kings wasn't only fear and reverence, there was also intimacy. Many rulers described their patron deities as friends or parents. Gudea of Lagash wrote prayers to his goddess Ningirsu as though speaking to a mentor. He described dreams in which she showed him how to build her temple, giving precise measurements and materials. He obeyed, and his reign prospered. That merging of architecture and revelation became a hallmark of Mesopotamian civilization. To build anything enduring, one first had to receive instruction from the divine. In time, the Sumerian gods themselves began to mirror their kings. They became more administrative, more structured, their myths filled with councils, decrees, and contracts. Heaven, once a place of creation and wonder, turned into a celestial court. The Anunnaki sat in judgment, deliberating over the fates of men. The language of rule had replaced the language of awe, yet through that bureaucracy ran a thread of empathy. The gods were distant but not indifferent. They observed, tested, and occasionally intervened, their motives as complex as those of any human ruler. To the people living under this system, life had purpose because it was ordered. Every role, from king to farmer, priest to scribe, was part of a divine structure. Work was worship, law was faith. The first written codes, like those of Ur-Nammu and later Hammurabi, claimed to come directly from the gods. Justice wasn't invented, it was revealed. The king's word was divine law not because of ego, but because of belief that order itself was sacred. And above it all the stars kept turning. The Sumerians divided the sky into constellations long before the Greeks gave them new names. They charted the path of the sun as it crossed the ecliptic, calling it the path of Anu. They watched Venus, sacred to Inanna, rise as the morning star and vanish as the evening one, its dual nature a symbol of transformation. The heavens weren't a mystery to be solved, they were a language to be read. Each celestial movement was a message, each eclipse a paragraph in an eternal dialogue between gods and men. That awareness gave birth to the earliest calendar, the foundation of timekeeping itself. By aligning human labour with the sky's rhythm, the Sumerians created the first organised society. Harvest festivals, temple rituals, and royal decrees all followed celestial patterns. The king, standing atop the ziggurat at dawn, wasn't simply greeting the sun. He was synchronizing the kingdom with the cosmos. Civilization became an imitation of the stars. As centuries passed, the divine right of kings grew into something more ambitious. The rulers of Babylon and Assyria traced their lineage directly to the Anunnaki. Clay inscriptions record kings claiming descent from gods like Shamash or Ishtar. Whether these claims were literal or political hardly mattered. Belief gave them weight. To rule meant to carry a fragment of divine blood. the same mixture of clay and breath that Enki once used to shape humanity. The king was not separate from his people. He was their perfected reflection, the point where mortal and celestial merged, and yet, beneath the ceremony and splendour, the old truth lingered. Kings were servants. Their power existed to maintain balance, not to break it. When pride turned them against the gods, ruin followed. The epics of Akkad and Ur all end the same way, with cities falling, temples burning, rulers lamenting their hubris. Each fall was interpreted not as defeat, but as correction. The universe, the Sumerians believed, always returned to balance. Even now, thousands of years later, that belief feels unshakable. The idea that authority must reflect order, that leaders are responsible to something greater than themselves, began here. The Sumerians may have clothed it in myth and ritual, but its logic still shapes every civilization that followed. We still look upward for validation, still measure our actions against invisible patterns. The stars no longer decide our harvests, but their symbolism endures. They remain the quiet witnesses of our hierarchies, the same lights that watched over the first kings of Eridu and Ur. In the end, kingship, like creation, was never about domination. It was about stewardship. The gods had given humanity life, and the kings carried that trust forward. Their crowns, their laws, their temples, all were extensions of that original agreement. They ruled not to command the world, but to preserve its order. Whether they succeeded or failed, they believed their purpose was sacred. The heavens above Eridu and Uruk are silent now, but the pattern remains. We still build systems, write codes, and seek meaning in cycles. The legacy of the first kings lies not in their conquests, but in their understanding that the stars and the soil are reflections of each other. The gods ruled from above, the kings ruled below, and humanity, caught between the two, learned the art of keeping balance. And from that balance came the next story, the one written in water and memory, when the world trembled under the weight of divine judgment, and a flood rose to wash the sky clean once more. It begins with silence, the kind that comes before storms when the air thickens and the world holds its breath. The Sumerians said that once, long ago, the sky itself grew heavy with sorrow. The gods had grown tired of their creation. The humans they had shaped from clay had multiplied too quickly, built too loudly, eaten too much of the world's patience. Their songs rose day and night, their smoke climbed into the heavens, their prayers became noise. What had been harmony now felt like chaos. The divine order was being drowned in its own echoes. Enlil, the stern one, could not bear it. He called the council of the gods and spoke of silence, of rest, of a world cleansed of its clamour. The others listened. Some agreed, others hesitated. Enki, as always, stood apart. He argued that destruction was not balance, that life once given could not be unmade without consequence. But Enlil's word carried weight, and so the decree was written. The flood would come. The Sumerians didn't tell this story in whispers of morality or sin. There was no talk of wickedness, no punishment for disobedience. It was about exhaustion, about limits, about the fragile rhythm between creation and control. Even the gods, they believed, could lose balance, and when they did, the world suffered. The earliest version of the story appears in the Epic of Atrahasis, carved into clay centuries before the more famous tale of Noah. It begins with the Anunnaki labouring, their burdens heavy. The lesser gods, the Igigi, rebel against Enlil's demands, throwing down their tools and surrounding his house in defiance. The council meets again. Enki proposes a solution. Create humans to bear the work of the gods. It works. For a while. The new beings till the soil, build cities, carry offerings. But as their numbers grow, so does their noise. Once again, the heavens lose their rest. So Enlil sends plagues, then droughts, then famine, each one meant to thin the population. Each time Enki intervenes, teaching humans how to heal, how to survive, how to adapt. Finally, Enlil decides to end it altogether. He calls upon the assembly to swear secrecy and unleashes the flood. Enki, bound by oath but unwilling to let his creation perish, finds a loophole. He speaks to the walls of a reed hut, knowing that a man named Atrahasis is listening on the other side. He tells him to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, to take aboard his family, animals, and seed of every kind, to prepare for 7 days of rain that will wash the earth clean. The description is simple, almost technical. The dimensions of the boat, the materials, the timing, each detail feels less like legend and more like record. When the storm comes, it's not fire or wrath that fills the sky, but water. The text says the noise of the flood was so great that even the gods grew frightened. They huddled together in heaven like children in a thunderstorm, watching the world they had made dissolve beneath the waves. When it ended, the sea was still. The boat came to rest upon a mountain. Atrahasis released a bird to search for land. When it didn't return, he knew the world had begun again. The parallels to later flood stories are unmistakable. The names change. Atrahasis becomes Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and later Noah in the Hebrew Scriptures. But the structure remains the same. Survival through warning, renewal through destruction, peace after silence. To the Sumerians, the flood wasn't just an event. It was the line between myth and history. Their king lists are divided by it, before the flood and after. The reigns before stretch into thousands of years. Those after become mortal, measurable, real. The deluge marks the beginning of time as we understand it, the shift from divine eternity to human chronology. Before it, kings ruled with the gods beside them. After, they ruled alone. Archaeologists have found layers of sediment in ancient Mesopotamian cities, thin bands of river clay that hint at catastrophic flooding around 2900 BCE. Not global, perhaps, but devastating enough to rewrite memory. It's easy to see how such an event could grow into a legend. A city swallowed by water becomes a world. A single survivor becomes humanity's second beginning. But myth is never just exaggeration. It's explanation. The flood became a way to understand cycles of destruction and renewal that nature itself enforces. For the Sumerians, water was both creation and undoing. It was Enki's gift, the life of rivers and fertility of soil, but also the element that erased everything when balance failed. The flood wasn't vengeance, it was reset. The gods didn't hate humanity. They needed quiet to start again. Afterward, Enki and Enlil reconciled. They agreed to limit human lifespan, to manage population, to preserve balance. The world resumed its rhythm, chastened but alive. That rhythm is what matters most. The flood wasn't an ending. It was the space between breaths. The gods destroyed, then restored. The survivors rebuilt. The temples rose again. The canals reopened. The scribes began carving once more. Civilization, fragile as it was, learned endurance. The clay tablets that tell this story are themselves acts of defiance against oblivion. Proof that even when the world is washed clean, memory survives. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, written centuries later, the flood becomes personal. Gilgamesh, seeking immortality, finds Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of that ancient deluge. The old man tells him how the gods decided to cleanse the earth, how he built his boat, how the storm lasted 6 days and nights. The details are nearly identical to Atrahasis, but the tone is heavier. Utnapishtim speaks not with gratitude, but weariness. Immortality, he says, is not a gift. It is a reminder of what has been lost. The flood gave him eternal life, but also eternal solitude. That nuance is what sets Mesopotamian myth apart. The Sumerians didn't believe in perfection or eternal happiness. They believed in cycles. Every creation carried its own destruction. Every life contained its ending. Even the gods were subject to this truth. The flood wasn't punishment, it was renewal at a cosmic scale. And when the waters receded, what emerged was not paradise, but memory. The physical flood may have ended, but the idea of it seeped into everything. It became the pattern for political collapse, for personal loss, for spiritual renewal. When cities fell, poets called it the flood of Enlil. When a dynasty ended, they said, the waters have risen. When the Tigris overflowed its banks, they didn't blame chance. They saw the echo of that ancient cleansing. History was a repetition of divine tides. It's strange to think that this idea, the world destroyed and reborn, originates in the same land that invented writing. The people who feared being forgotten created the very tools that made memory possible. Their tablets were small arcs, each one carrying stories across the floods of time. Without them, the myth would have drowned with the cities that birthed it. Instead, it travelled north to Akkad, west to Canaan, across generations and tongues. By the time it reached Hebrew scribes, it had already been rewritten 100 times, but the essence remained. Humanity survives because knowledge survives. In the Sumerian vision, after the waters fell, the gods gathered again. Enlil, looking upon the desolation, regretted his decision. Enki, ever the mediator, proposed a new covenant. Humanity would no longer live under the same conditions. They would suffer and age, but they would also learn. The gods would send wisdom instead of destruction. From that moment, knowledge became the new form of divine mercy. That shift marks one of the most profound transformations in mythic thought. Power gives way to understanding. The flood ends the era of direct intervention and begins the age of human responsibility. The gods no longer walk among men, they guide from afar. The world has been reset, and in its silence, humanity inherits creation. The traces of this transition can still be seen in the ruins of the old cities. Archaeologists find layers of rebuilding, new temples built atop older ones, fresh clay covering flood-swept foundations. Each reconstruction begins with ritual purification, a symbolic echo of the flood. Before laying the first brick, priests poured water over the ground, reciting hymns that invoked Enki's forgiveness and Enlil's restraint. They believed that by repeating the act of renewal, they kept chaos at bay. Civilization itself became a form of flood control. What makes this story endure isn't its scale, but its empathy. The flood that erased the sky didn't erase humanity's worth. It affirmed it. Enki's quiet defiance, the act of warning Atrahasis, became the model for compassion in a world ruled by order. It's the same impulse that would later turn gods into protectors, teachers, and saviours. The flood marks the first time a deity chooses mercy over law. That choice, written into clay, has shaped human imagination ever since. The Sumerians understood that survival was not about escaping destruction, but remembering through it. Each retelling of the flood was an act of resilience, a reassurance that even the greatest loss could be endured. The waters might erase, but they could not silence. The sky might darken, but dawn would return. Balance, not permanence, was the promise of the gods. Over centuries, the flood story spread across continents, transformed by each new culture that adopted it. In Babylon, it became a moral lesson. In Greece, a tale of rebirth. In India, a warning of cycles. But its heart remained Sumerian, the understanding that every civilization must reckon with its own floods, both real and symbolic. Whether rivers overflowing or empires collapsing, the rhythm repeats: rise, fall, rebuild. In the quiet after the storm, when the world was new again, the survivors of that ancient deluge must have looked to the horizon and seen something unfamiliar. The air would have smelled of mud and salt, the ground soft beneath their feet. The temples were gone, the crops destroyed, but the sky above them was clear. For the first time, There was nothing between humanity and the heavens. No towers, no ladders, no intermediaries, just open air. Perhaps that was the true meaning of the flood. Not destruction, but revelation. The reminder that the link between earth and sky was never made of stone, but of endurance. When the Sumerians told their children of the flood, they didn't warn them to fear the gods. They told them to listen, to water, to wind, to the silence before storms. They said that the world breathes in cycles, and that the wise learn to move with it. They said that when the sky grows heavy, it's not anger, but balance returning, and that after every flood, something new always rises, and so it did. The world rebuilt itself, not just in cities and temples, but in memory. The flood became the hinge of myth, the moment when humanity stopped being clay-shaped by gods and became clay-shaping itself. What followed would not be innocence, but awareness. The gods had tested their creation and found it capable of survival. And from that survival came a new kind of relationship, less obedient, more curious. The gods would remain, but humanity had begun to see itself reflected in them. The flood that erased the sky did not erase the story. It only cleared space for it to be told again. When the floodwaters retreated and the air grew quiet again, the world was different. The land that had once belonged to the gods now belonged to the survivors. The divine had receded into the distance, and humanity, standing on the damp soil of its own renewal, began to remember. The stories that had once been lived became lessons, and lessons became myths. What had been presence became memory. For the Sumerians, this transition wasn't a loss of faith. It was the beginning of history. Their gods no longer walked among them, but their traces remained in every ritual, every city, every law written in clay. The world had been washed clean, and in that emptiness people began to fill it again, with memory, with meaning, with record. The first scribes appeared soon after, carrying reed styluses and clay tablets. They wrote not only for trade or administration, but to preserve the order of things, to capture the divine structure in symbols that would not fade. In their eyes, writing was a sacred act, a continuation of creation itself. Each mark was an echo of the god's language, the same geometric shapes that had once described the design of the universe. The Sumerians called it cuneiform, wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet earth, a human imitation of divine inscription. What makes those tablets remarkable is their mix of the mundane and the eternal. On one, a list of grain deliveries. On another, a hymn to Inanna, radiant queen of heaven. On yet another, an epic describing gods who shaped stars. Together they show a civilization bridging two worlds, the practical and the spiritual, without dividing them. The act of remembering was both commerce and prayer. As cities rose again from the mud, the Sumerians turned their attention to continuity. They understood that memory fades faster than stone, so they built temples to anchor it. Each temple carried the same design as the first one in Eridu, a central shrine surrounded by courtyards and storage rooms aligned to the stars. The pattern was deliberate. The gods might have withdrawn, but the architecture of devotion would hold their place. To build was to remember, to maintain was to honour. Archaeologists have uncovered layers upon layers of these temples, stacked like geological strata of belief. Beneath the ziggurat of Ur, there are foundations of older temples, and beneath those, older still. Each generation built upon the remains of the last, never destroying but covering, preserving, layering. In those layers lies the physical form of memory itself, humanity's attempt to keep the divine close by embedding it into the ground. The stories of the gods became the framework for human life. Every law and custom drew from mythic precedent. The flood had shown that even gods could err, that order could be broken and restored. From that understanding came justice. The Code of Unamu, one of the earliest known sets of laws, claimed to have been given directly by the god Nana to his chosen king. It declared that fairness and truth must be maintained because the gods demanded it, not through fear, but through remembrance of the world's fragility. Memory became the new form of worship. Festivals reenacted creation and renewal. Priests recited long genealogies of kings and gods, tracing their lineage back to the beginning. Every year, during the New Year festival, the people of Babylon would gather as priests read the Enuma Elish, the great creation epic derived from Sumerian roots. The story was not entertainment, it was maintenance. By retelling it, the people kept the universe stable, reminding both heaven and earth of their shared history. The line between myth and record was never clear. The Sumerians didn't see a difference. Their history was not a sequence of verifiable events, but a pattern of divine cycles. When kings rose, they said kingship had descended from heaven once more. When cities fell, they wrote that the gods had turned their gaze away. Every political shift, every natural disaster, every triumph or loss was mapped onto the same mythic template. Myth explained history, and history sustained myth. The Sumerian king list embodies this blend. It begins with Eridu, the first city, then lists rulers of impossible ages, thousands of years each, before declaring, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood, reigns shorten, becoming human in scale. Scholars now see it as one of the earliest attempts to bridge myth and chronology, to draw a line between divine timelessness and mortal time. The Sumerians, it seems, were already trying to understand themselves as creatures of both story and record. This transformation from myth to memory didn't happen all at once. It unfolded over centuries, through generations of scribes copying old texts onto new tablets. They added details, revised words, translated dialects. Each copy was both preservation and reinvention. The gods, once unchanging, began to evolve as language itself changed. In one city, Enki became Ea. In another, Inanna became Ishtar. The stories adapted, not to deceive, but to survive. Memory is never static. It reshapes itself to fit the minds that hold it. In this way, the Sumerians accomplished something extraordinary. They turned religion into continuity, myth into civilization. Their memory became the seed from which all later cultures in the region would grow. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians would all inherit fragments of their mythology, rewriting them in new forms, but always retaining the same structure: the divine descent, the flood, the wisdom of the gods, the kingship ordained by heaven. The blueprint of belief never changed, only the language did. You can see this continuity in the way their temples evolved. The ziggurat, rising in tiers toward the heavens, became the physical symbol of ascent. To climb its steps was to retrace the path from earth to sky, from mortal to divine. Each level represented a layer of the cosmos: the underworld, the earth, the air, the stars. At the summit stood a small shrine, simple and bare, where the divine presence was said to dwell. Priests would ascend carrying offerings, not to ask for miracles, but to reaffirm connection. The journey upward was an act of remembrance. The Sumerians also remembered through music. Fragments of their hymns still exist, carved in notation that scholars have learned to play. The melodies are haunting, minor, repetitive, steady like a heartbeat. The lyrics praise gods not for power but for wisdom, not for conquest but for guidance. These songs were sung daily in temples, their rhythms matching the motion of labourers outside, the turning of irrigation wheels, the footsteps of workers in the fields. Sound became another form of memory, carrying the gods' names through ordinary life. It's easy to forget how fragile such memory was. Clay tablets could break, fires could destroy archives, floods could erase cities, and yet enough survived to reconstruct a history spanning millennia. Some tablets bear signs of having been recopied dozens of times, their edges smoothed by use. To the Sumerians, rewriting a text was an act of devotion equal to prayer. Each scribe saw himself as a link in an unbroken chain reaching back to the first words ever pressed into clay. In time, this reverence for memory became philosophy. The idea that humanity could preserve divine truth through its own effort, through writing, through law, through order, was revolutionary. It implied that knowledge itself was sacred. The gods might dwell in the heavens, but their wisdom could live on earth. In that sense, the Sumerians invented more than civilization. They invented continuity. Their understanding of the past wasn't linear, it was circular. Myths repeated because history repeated. Floods came and went. Empires rose and fell. But through writing, through ritual, the cycle gained permanence. The gods could erase the world, but not the memory of it. Humanity had learned to leave traces that even divine water could not wash away. This blending of myth and memory would shape all later civilizations. The Egyptians would build tombs filled with texts to guide the dead. The Hebrews would turn oral traditions into scripture. The Greeks would transform divine epics into philosophy. Each of them, knowingly or not, followed the Sumerian path. The path of turning experience into record, belief into narrative. The transition from gods to words, from presence to remembrance, began on the banks of the Euphrates. Even now, when archaeologists unearth tablets from the ruins of Ur or Lagash, they're recovering more than artifacts. They're recovering continuity. Every cracked tablet, every line of cuneiform is a voice from a world that refused to vanish. The flood may have erased the cities, but it could not silence the desire to remember. That desire became the foundation of history itself. In one fragment from the city of Nippur, a scribe writes a single line: "What has been spoken is not lost." The rest of the tablet is broken, the meaning incomplete, but the sentiment survives. It's the first statement of historical consciousness ever recorded. The understanding that to speak, to write, to remember is to defy oblivion. Through this quiet act of defiance, myth became memory. The gods withdrew to the heavens, leaving humanity the task of keeping their names alive. Every ritual, every law, every story was a form of remembrance, a way of saying, we were shaped, and we still remember the hands that shaped us. The Sumerians may not have known how long their memory would last, but they built as if it would never fade. And in a way, it hasn't. Their words lie beneath ours, their symbols buried in our alphabets, their stories hidden in our scriptures. Every time we speak of creation, flood, kings or heavens, we echo them. The memory they began has become the myth we live inside, and as that memory travelled through time, it would begin to change once more. The gods would lose their thrones, the heavens would turn into stars, and the myths that once explained the divine would start to resemble something else. Something mechanical, distant, perhaps cosmic. Humanity would begin to ask not where the gods went, but who they truly were. Somewhere between the last temples of Sumer and the dawn of our modern skies, the old stories began to sound different. What had once been myth began to feel like memory disguised as metaphor. The gods who had walked among people, the shining ones who descended, the teachers who carried knowledge from the heavens, these figures didn't fade entirely. They changed their names, shifted their forms, and followed us into a new kind of imagination. As humanity looked upward again, not for worship but for understanding, a quiet idea began to rise. What if the gods were never gods at all? What if they were visitors? The ancient astronaut theory didn't appear in dusty libraries of old priests or the sermons of kings. It was born much later in an age of rockets and radio waves, when the distance between heaven and earth no longer seemed infinite. It emerged from a single, unsettling realization that many of the world's oldest myths describe something that sounds eerily familiar to modern ears. Beings descending from the sky, radiant lights, loud machines, knowledge gifted from above. When the language of faith met the language of technology, a bridge appeared and across it walked an idea older than reason itself. Its roots, of course, reach back to Sumer. Every thread of the theory eventually returns to those tablets. The same wedges of clay that once told of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The phrase, simple and literal, became the cornerstone of a new interpretation. What if the ancient scribes weren't writing poetry but history? What if the descent of the gods was not divine revelation but contact? In the 20th century, that question found its voice in authors like Zecharia Sitchin. His books, especially The 12th Planet, claim that the Sumerians were not describing gods, but extraterrestrial visitors from a distant world, Nibiru, a planet said to move in a long elliptical orbit around the Sun. According to Sitchin, these beings, the Anunnaki, came to Earth tens of thousands of years ago in search of resources, particularly gold, and in doing so altered the course of human evolution. They created humanity as a hybrid species, part terrestrial, part alien, to serve as labourers in their operations. Mainstream scholars rejected these claims, dismissing them as speculative fantasy. The tablets, they argued, contain no direct evidence of such a planet or such a purpose. The Sumerian texts speak of gods and rituals, not spacecraft and mining. But the allure of Sitchin's idea didn't depend on academic approval. It depended on possibility. And possibility is something humans have never stopped chasing. What made the theory compelling wasn't just the claims, but the timing. The 20th century had already dismantled the ancient boundaries between heaven and earth. We had learned to send voices into space, to land on the moon, to see the world from above. In doing so, the stories of the ancients began to sound less like mythology and more like a kind of memory spoken in symbols. The language of gods descending in fire could now be reimagined through the language of propulsion and light. The chariots of heaven could be machines. The thunder of divine arrival could be the roar of engines. It's easy to understand the temptation. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as radiant beings whose faces shone like the sun, whose descent from the sky was marked by storms and brightness. They spoke of skyboats and fiery chambers, of beings who measured the heavens and shaped life from clay mixed with divine essence. To a modern reader, the imagery fits neatly into a technological framework. But context is everything. The Sumerians lived in a world where light and fire were sacred metaphors, where the sky was the boundary of the divine. Their words may describe not machines, but manifestations of meaning, the awe of natural power personified. And yet there's a strange consistency that makes the theory linger. The same stories appear across continents, gods descending from the heavens, teaching agriculture, astronomy, and language. The Dogon of Mali speak of visitors from the Iria star system. The ancient Egyptians described Thoth, the ibis-headed god of knowledge, arriving in shining vessels. The Mayans recorded similar encounters. Everywhere, the pattern repeats. The names differ, but the structure is the same. Teachers from the sky, bringing civilization to Earth. To some, this universality suggests shared psychology, the human need to externalize the unknown. To others, it hints at shared experience remembered and reshaped through millennia. In either case, the result is the same, a persistent belief that knowledge was not born but given. When you look back at the Sumerian worldview, it's clear they didn't see themselves as inventors of civilization. They saw themselves as recipients. Their language, writing, mathematics and astronomy all came, they said, from the gods. They didn't claim credit, they claimed inheritance. The very word me, a key Sumerian term, meant divine decree, the invisible blueprint of order given to humanity by the Anunnaki. Every art, every law, every aspect of culture was considered one of these me, and each was a gift. Sitchin and others like him took that belief literally. To them, these gifts were transmissions of knowledge from an advanced species. The myths, in their view, were primitive descriptions of encounters with technology. The gods' luminous garments became spacesuits, their flying chariots became aircraft. The tablets describing the mixing of divine blood with clay became genetic engineering. The stories of long-lived kings became evidence of beings whose lifespans extended beyond human limits. It's not difficult to see how such reinterpretations captured imaginations. They gave ancient myth a modern vocabulary. They took the distant gods of the past and made them tangible, almost human in their motives. Instead of unreachably divine beings, they became explorers, scientists, colonists. They turned the mystery of faith into the language of science fiction. But the line between fiction and interpretation is thin, and perhaps that's why the idea endures. Archaeologists, linguists, and historians counter these readings with context. The Sumerian word Anunnaki, they note, doesn't mean extraterrestrial but offspring of Anu, the sky god. Their descent isn't a flight from space but a symbolic act of authority, divine forces coming down to govern the earth. The stories of creation, floods, and instruction are metaphors for the evolution of consciousness and society, not literal encounters. Still, even among the cautious, there's a quiet recognition that something about the Sumerian myths feels too detailed, too structured, to dismiss as pure imagination. Perhaps that's why the ancient astronaut question persists. It isn't a matter of proof, but of resonance. The Sumerians spoke of a world where knowledge came from above, where the heavens were not empty but alive. Modern humans, even after centuries of science, have returned to that same horizon, pointing telescopes at distant stars, listening for signals, hoping for voices. The language has changed, but the longing hasn't. When Sitchin described Nibiru, the supposed 12th planet of the solar system, he imagined it as a vast, slow-moving world whose orbit carried it far beyond Pluto for most of its cycle, returning near Earth only every few thousand years. He believed that during one such passage the Anunnaki came here, establishing colonies and creating humanity as their workers. According to him, they left but promised to return when their orbit brought them close again. It's a bold story, part myth, part astronomy, part hope. No telescope has ever found Nibiru, no evidence has confirmed it. Yet the idea refuses to die, perhaps because it touches something deeper than curiosity. It touches the oldest human question: are we alone? Even if the answer is no, that doesn't mean it must match the myth. But the myth itself, of visitors from the sky shaping life, seems almost prophetic when viewed through the lens of modern discovery. We now know that planets orbit nearly every star, that life's ingredients scatter across galaxies, that cosmic collisions once seeded our own world. The Sumerians said life came from the heavens, and in a way, they were right. Stardust, radiation, and water ice carried on comets. These are our origins, written not in tablets, but in atoms. Maybe the Anunnaki were never aliens or gods. Maybe they were metaphors for that truth, the recognition that we are children of the cosmos, born from the sky itself, and yet there's something undeniably human about wanting it to be literal. To imagine someone coming down, shaping us, teaching us, leaving behind ruins as reminders. It's a comforting thought that our intelligence was designed, not accidental, that our creators were explorers, not forces of chance. The Sumerians believed their gods cared about the order of the world. They wrote entire epics about their debates and decisions. In a sense, the Anunnaki represented an early form of cosmic kinship, the idea that the universe watches over its own creations. When people today look at ziggurats and call them launch pads, they're not really talking about architecture. They're expressing a longing for connection, the same longing that made the first Sumerians climb those temple steps to reach the heavens. Whether those gods were real beings or symbols of our own potential doesn't change the emotion behind it. The desire to meet our makers, to understand why we exist, is the same now as it was 5,000 years ago. That's what makes the ancient astronaut question less about aliens and more about memory. The myths may not describe spacecraft, but they describe encounters, with mystery, with knowledge, with the unknown made visible. The Sumerians gave those encounters names and faces. We give them formulas and probes. But the dialogue hasn't changed. We're still asking the same thing, just in a different language. In that sense, the question isn't about whether the Anunnaki were real visitors, but about why we continue to feel their absence. The silence of the stars mirrors the silence of the gods. Both invite the same yearning, the same search for signs. The clay tablets and the radio telescopes are part of the same continuum. The attempt to speak across distance, to remember a conversation we once believed we had. Perhaps that's what the myth was always about. Not proof, but participation. The Sumerians didn't see their gods as separate. They saw them as extensions of the cosmos' own intelligence. When they wrote of descent from heaven, they were describing communication, not colonization. The heavens spoke, and the earth answered. When we send signals into space today, we are continuing that conversation, even if we no longer call it prayer. The ancient astronaut question survives not because of evidence, but because of reflection. It forces us to reconsider what those old stories meant. Were the Sumerians documenting events, or were they encoding wisdom in symbols? Were the Anunnaki visitors, or visions of our own potential projected onto the sky? Both possibilities are profound, because both suggest the same truth. We are connected to something greater than ourselves. The irony is that by searching the stars for our makers, we might be proving their point. The Sumerians believed knowledge was divine, that the pursuit of understanding was sacred. Every telescope, every spacecraft, every act of exploration fulfills that belief. We've become the very beings they once imagined, the descendants of the sky, returning the gaze upward. In the end, whether the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, or metaphors matters less than the fact that we still look for them. The story they began, the descent of light, the gift of knowledge, the creation of life, continues, written now in mathematics instead of myth. The question remains open, not because it lacks an answer, but because it was never meant to close. It was meant to keep us reaching. And from that question will rise another, one that moves even closer to our own being. The mystery written not in clay or stone, but in the code of our blood. Because if the gods, or whoever they were, left any sign of themselves, it might not be in the stars at all. It might be within us. If the stories of the Anunnaki were written to explain how life began, then what we carry within us may be their most enduring legacy. The Sumerians believed that to create humanity, the gods mixed clay with divine essence, a fusion of earth and heaven. It wasn't simply metaphor to them, it was biology in the language of myth, and whether we call that essence spirit, breath, or code, the idea remains the same. Something extraordinary was woven into the substance of life. Modern science, without intending to, circles the same mystery. We now understand that everything living on this planet shares a single thread, DNA, the molecule that holds the instructions for existence. It's written not in words or symbols, but in sequences, 4 letters endlessly rearranging themselves into the pattern of every creature that has ever lived. In its structure, there's something eerily familiar. A code older than language, precise as mathematics, yet flexible enough to build infinite forms from a few repeating signs. It is both architecture and memory, a script written long before clay tablets or temples. When the Sumerians spoke of being shaped by gods who combined their essence with clay, they may have been expressing an intuition far beyond their technology. They understood that humanity was not separate from the world, but an extension of it, Earth animated by something invisible. Their myth described an act of synthesis, the meeting of matter and meaning. Today, we describe that same synthesis through chemistry and evolution, but the story hasn't changed much. We're still telling ourselves how the Earth learned to think. The Sumerian story of Enki and Ninhursag shaping humanity from clay and divine blood could easily be read as a poetic reflection of what we now see in molecular biology. The gods provide a fragment of themselves, a spark that carries their nature, and from that spark comes a new species capable of reason, language, and self-awareness. The parallels are almost unsettling. DNA, after all, is a code capable of transmitting not just physical traits, but behavior, instinct, and potential. It is the mechanism by which memory becomes matter. The Sumerians gave that mechanism a face. In the ancient astronaut interpretations, this idea becomes literal. The Anunnaki, they say, engineered humanity by combining their own genetic material with that of early hominids, creating a hybrid species intelligent enough to serve but independent enough to survive. It's a narrative that transforms the myth into technology. Divine essence becomes genetic material, and creation becomes manipulation. To skeptics, it's fantasy. To believers, revelation. But beneath the speculation lies a question older than science itself. How did consciousness arise? What the Sumerians framed as divine intervention, we now describe as a biological leap. Somewhere in the long evolution from ape to human, something shifted, not in bone or muscle, but in mind. The sudden appearance of symbolic thought, art, language, and abstract reasoning marks a transformation that still puzzles researchers. Genetic evidence shows that the human brain expanded rapidly within a relatively short span of evolutionary time, developing capacities far beyond immediate survival. Some see this as the natural outcome of selection. Others sense something more abrupt, almost intentional. The myth of the Anunnaki fits neatly into that uncertainty, filling the silence with purpose. To them, the act of creation was not random. It was planned. Humanity wasn't born of accident, but design. That belief shaped their culture deeply. They saw themselves as caretakers, chosen to continue the God's work, not as evolutionary accidents, but as deliberate participants in the order of the world. When we read their tablets today, we can still hear the echo of that confidence, the certainty that their existence had direction. It's strange how, thousands of years later, we've returned to similar questions, but with microscopes instead of altars. Scientists now edit genes, rewrite the code of life, and even design synthetic organisms. In laboratories across the world, creation has become engineering. The line between myth and method is thinner than it seems. The Sumerians imagined gods shaping humans from clay. We mould cells in petri dishes. They describe divine essence mixing with earth. We splice DNA from different species to understand function. They told of gods granting knowledge. We map genomes to uncover the hidden architecture of life. The language is different, but the intent, to understand and to recreate, is the same. The phrase, blueprints in our blood, could be taken literally. Every cell in the body contains the full plan for building a human being, written in a language we're only beginning to fully comprehend. The Sumerians might have called it the Miya, the divine ordinances, invisible forces that govern reality. They saw those decrees as patterns embedded in the world, dictating the flow of life, art, justice, and creation. When modern scientists look at DNA, they're staring at something very similar. Patterns that define the form and fate of every living thing. The resemblance between the two ideas is more than poetic. It's conceptual continuity. If we think of the Anunnaki as metaphors for those forces, their blood becomes a symbol for the information that animates life. The mixing of clay and divine substance is the meeting of inert matter and dynamic structure. The myth captures, in its way, what science now confirms, that life is not a spontaneous chaos, but an ordered expression of information. Every living thing is a message, a translation of cosmic principles into biological form. The gods' breath, their essence, their blood. These were early attempts to name what we now call data. There's an ancient hymn to Enki that describes him as the one who knows the destinies of all beings, who writes their fates upon the tablets of heaven. To the Sumerians, destiny wasn't abstract. It was written somewhere, like a record in the sky. Today we locate that writing not in heaven but in the nucleus. The parallel is almost unsettling. Both visions describe existence as scripted, but flexible. Both imply that creation is an act of writing. The deeper one looks into the cell, the more mythic it begins to feel. Strings of genetic code fold into spirals, interacting with invisible energies, transmitting instructions with precision no craftsman could match. Each gene is a phrase, each chromosome a paragraph. Together they form the story of a species. Perhaps it's no wonder the ancients imagined their gods as scribes. The cosmos to them was not silent, but articulate. When researchers decoded the human genome at the turn of the 21st century, they spoke of it in language strikingly close to reverence. They called it the Book of Life, the script of creation, the language in which God wrote. Whether the speaker was religious or not, the metaphor came naturally. The deeper we look into our biology, the more it feels like translation, reading messages written long before humanity could exist to interpret them. The Sumerians believed that their gods stored knowledge in tablets that could command the elements themselves. Enki's temple at Eridu was said to hold these sacred records, the blueprints of civilization. They described them as shimmering living documents that contained the essence of reality. In our age, we store information in silicon and carbon, in strands of DNA that can hold entire libraries. The metaphor has become literal. We have learned to inscribe knowledge into life itself. Whether the Anunnaki were mythic gods or distant ancestors, their greatest gift may have been the concept of inheritance, the idea that knowledge passes forward, carried in flesh, word, or memory. We inherit more than genes. We inherit the impulse to understand where those genes came from, the urge to decode the pattern that binds us to the world. That impulse is as old as Eridu, as enduring as the clay on which their stories were written. Every civilization since has carried fragments of that awareness. The Egyptians wrote of divine breath animating the pharaohs. The Hebrews spoke of life breathed into dust. The Greeks imagined Prometheus crafting humans from clay and fire. The connection between earth and essence never disappeared. It evolved just as we did, adapting to new languages, new sciences, new mythologies. The blueprint changed shape, but never meaning. To look at DNA under a microscope is to see the same idea the Sumerians carved into stone, that life is shaped by order, that creation follows design. Whether that design arose from gods, nature, or the deep mathematics of the universe, the result is the same. Structure in motion, intelligence in matter. The myth captured it in story. Science captures it in sequence. In both, there's humility. The Sumerians never claimed ownership of creation. They saw themselves as participants in a process larger than comprehension. The modern world, despite its technology, still stands in the same place. We can edit genes, but we cannot yet define consciousness. We can map the code, but we do not know why it exists at all. For all our knowledge, we are still looking at something that feels like handwriting we cannot quite decipher. When the ancients said that divine essence flowed in human veins, they weren't describing biology. They were describing significance. To be alive was to contain a trace of the divine pattern, to be a fragment of the cosmos that could look back and recognize itself. That recognition is what consciousness became. We carry not just the blueprint of our bodies, but the memory of awareness itself, the instinct to remember, to question, to create. There's a quiet continuity in that thought. The Sumerians told their children that humans were shaped to tend the earth, to maintain balance between heaven and soil. Science, in its own way, has brought us to the same conclusion, that our survival depends on harmony with the systems that sustain us, that our biology is bound to the planet that birthed it. The clay is still beneath our feet, the blueprint still within us. The language has changed, but the truth has not. The story of creation was never meant to end with the gods. It was meant to continue through us. Every heartbeat, every breath, every thought is a repetition of that original fusion between matter and meaning. The blood that carries oxygen also carries history. The cells that divide carry memory older than any civilization. Within us are instructions written by time, by chance, by forces we still struggle to name. Whether we call them gods, nature, or physics, they are the same authors, the same scribes of existence. In the end, the Anunnaki may not have left behind temples of gold or machines of flight, but something far more permanent. They left a pattern, a rhythm of creation that still plays inside every living being. The blueprint of their presence, if it ever existed, didn't remain in the sky. It descended, mingled with clay, and became us. We are the living record. The story didn't stop when the gods departed. It continues in blood and code, in thought and curiosity, in the restless drive to know what shaped us. The clay remembers the hands that moulded it, even when the moulders are gone. The blood remembers the spark that first set it in motion. And as long as memory survives, whether carved in stone or written in a cell, the story of creation never truly ends. The Sumerians said that when the gods made humanity, they mixed their own essence into the earth, so they would never be forgotten. Thousands of years later, we've proven them right. We still carry that essence, not as myth, but as molecule. The gods may have left the sky, but they remain in the pattern that beats beneath our skin. And as the pattern unfolds, as knowledge grows and memory deepens, humanity will begin to see not just the blueprints of life, but the shape of its purpose, a pattern that leads from creation to self-awareness, from myth to memory, and from memory back to the stars. When the Sumerians looked at the sky, they didn't see silence. They saw a conversation. The stars spoke in patterns, the wind carried words, and the flow of rivers answered them. Every corner of their world was alive with communication. To them, the universe wasn't made of matter alone. It was made of language. Not the kind spoken by mouths or written on tablets, but a deeper syntax, the rhythm by which existence itself expressed meaning. They called it the language of the gods. This language didn't sound like human speech. It wasn't confined to sound at all. It lived in signs, in symbols, in cycles. The Sumerians believed the gods spoke through everything that moved in harmony, the course of planets, the growth of crops, the rising and setting of the sun. To interpret those motions was to listen. That's why their priests were not just servants of ritual, but interpreters of signs. To read the world was to hear the divine. Every civilization that followed inherited some fragment of that belief. Egypt had its hieroglyphs, carved to capture divine order. The Hebrews spoke of a word through which all things were made. The Greeks called it logos, reason, structure, the language behind the visible. But it begins in Sumer with the idea that creation itself was an act of speech. The gods spoke, and the world became. Each sound, each symbol, each vibration was a command that shaped reality. In the myth of Enki, the god of wisdom is said to fix the destinies of all beings by uttering words that could not be undone. His speech didn't describe the world, it built it. The Sumerians understood power in this way. To name something was to shape it. Every god, every force of nature, every city and star had a name that carried its essence. To speak that name correctly was to participate in its being. That's why their prayers were precise, their incantations measured. Language wasn't communication, it was creation. The cuneiform script they developed was more than writing. It was a continuation of this sacred idea. The wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay were not arbitrary marks. They were echoes of the first divine utterances. Each sign was both sound and symbol, sound and spirit. When scribes learned to write, they were not merely learning letters, they were learning to imitate the gods. Their styluses were miniature tools of creation, carving reality into clay. One of the oldest surviving hymns describes the goddess Nisaba, patroness of writing and knowledge, as she who holds the tablet of the heavens. She was not a figure of fiction, but a reflection of faith in written order. The Sumerians believed that somewhere, beyond sight, there existed a great celestial archive where all destinies were recorded in the divine script. The movement of stars, the birth of kings, the flow of rivers, all inscribed long before they happened. The task of human scribes was to copy those records as best they could, to mirror heaven on earth. Writing was remembrance, but it was also alignment. Through language, the Sumerians bridged the distance between gods and men. Every temple hymn, every administrative record, every spell of protection or praise was part of the same effort, to keep the dialogue alive. To stop writing, to stop speaking the names of the gods, would have meant allowing silence to return. And silence, in their eyes, was the first step toward chaos. In the myth of the me, Enki holds the sacred decrees that govern existence. They are described as abstract forces, yet each has a name: kingship, truth, craftsmanship, song, love, judgment. When Inanna, goddess of ambition and desire, visits Enki's temple, she persuades him to give her these me, one by one. As she carries them away in her boat, the world begins to change. Civilization spreads, music, law, and art come to life. The myth suggests that every act of culture is a transmission of divine language passed from the gods to humanity. The words of the gods became the words of men. That idea still lingers, even now. Every form of human expression, writing, art, mathematics, traces back to this same belief that meaning precedes existence. The alphabet, the equation, the poem, all are descendants of the language of the gods. They are ways of describing reality so precisely that reality responds. When scientists describe a law of nature, when poets find the perfect line, when programmers write code that instructs a machine, they are all in essence continuing the oldest act of creation, turning thought into form. The Sumerians saw that act as sacred imitation. Their scribes were not separate from their priests, they were one and the same. Knowledge and worship were inseparable because both involved reading the divine structure. To write was to serve, to speak was to sustain. Every ceremony, every offering, every festival was a kind of dialogue, a way of ensuring that the gods' language remained alive in the human world. Even their architecture reflected this. Ziggurats were not only monuments to the heavens, they were also physical syllables, shaped phrases of stone. Each layer represented a tone in the divine language, rising toward the sky like a prayer frozen in form. When the priests climbed those steps, carrying offerings and chanting hymns, they were reenacting the syntax of creation, the ascending rhythm that linked heaven and earth. To the Sumerians, sound itself was sacred. Music and chant were not entertainment, but mechanisms of harmony. The intervals between notes were mathematical reflections of cosmic balance. Every temple had musicians whose role was to maintain that equilibrium through daily performance. Their instruments, lyres, harps, flutes, were tuned to celestial patterns. The vibrations they produced were thought to resonate with the gods' own frequencies, keeping the universe in tune. It's remarkable how this belief parallels modern discoveries. Physics now tells us that vibration underlies everything, that matter is a symphony of frequencies, that energy and sound are two expressions of the same underlying structure. The Sumerians sensed this intuitively. Their myths spoke of creation through voice, of order born from resonance. To them, the world was not a machine but a song. Even language as we know it carries traces of that ancient understanding. The human capacity for speech, the ability to turn thought into sound and sound into meaning, is one of evolution's strangest miracles. It appeared suddenly, almost inexplicably, as if something had switched on within the species. The Sumerians would have said it was a gift from Enki, the god who gave names to all things. Science calls it the development of complex symbolic cognition, but the outcome is the same. Language is what makes us conscious. It allows us to describe ourselves, to imagine, to remember. It is the blueprint of awareness itself. There's an ancient Sumerian proverb carved into a fragment of clay. A word spoken is a seed planted. It captures the essence of their worldview. Speech has consequence. To name something brings it closer to reality. To speak carelessly is to invite disorder. This belief shaped not only their religion but their ethics. Even kings measured their words. To lie was not just dishonour, it was cosmic imbalance. Truth was not moral virtue, it was alignment with the structure of the universe. When we study their language now, when we trace the roots of our own words back to theirs, we find connections that have never fully broken. The Sumerian word for god, Dingir, also meant star. The same sign used to represent divinity marked the heavens. Their concept of the divine was inseparable from the celestial, and their language reflected that. Every symbol carried multiple meanings, earthly, heavenly, spiritual, all woven together like threads of a single pattern. To understand one was to glimpse the others. That complexity is what makes their writing so enduring. Even after the fall of Sumer, the script continued for millennia, adapted by Akkadians, Babylonians and Assyrians. It became the shared medium of the ancient Near East, a kind of lingua franca of civilization. When new empires rose, they didn't erase the language, they inherited it. The gods may have changed names, but their words remained. The language of the gods had become the language of humanity, and perhaps that was always the intention. The myth of Babel, written long after the age of Sumer, echoes this transformation. It speaks of a time when humanity shared one language, when they built a tower to reach the heavens. The gods, fearing unity, scattered their speech, but the origin of that story lies in the same soil as Sumer's ziggurats. The tower that reached the sky was never about arrogance, it was about communication. Humanity had learned too well the divine language, and in learning it, had blurred the boundary between creator and creation. The scattering of tongues was not punishment, it was division, a necessary silence to restore distinction. Today, in the patterns of code and the structure of digital communication, something ancient stirs again. The systems that connect our voices across the planet are built from languages, binary, algorithmic, symbolic, that function on rules of creation as strict as any Sumerian incantation. Each command builds, transforms, or destroys within its own reality. The screen has become a new clay tablet, and the words we write there are as enduring, as consequential, as those pressed into mud 5,000 years ago. We are still, in essence, writing with the stylus of the gods. Perhaps that is the final legacy of the Sumerians, not their temples or their kings, but their understanding that language itself is divine. Every word we speak, every story we tell, carries a fragment of that first utterance that shaped the world. To remember that is to remember what they knew, that silence is not absence, but potential, that sound is creation made visible. Even now, as we study their tablets in museums and decipher their scripts under bright laboratory lights, the words still hum with the same rhythm they once carried in temple air. They are not relics, they are echoes. And in those echoes, the language of the gods still speaks, through us, through the stories we tell, through the names we give to stars and atoms alike. The conversation never ended, it changed forms. The gods' language, once carved in clay, now exists in the code of our blood, in the mathematics that describe galaxies, in the speech that connects one mind to another. Every discovery, every creation, every expression is another line in the same sentence that began at the dawn of time. The Sumerians were right to believe that the world was written. They just couldn't have imagined how far the sentence would go. Long after the last temple fell silent and the gods' names faded from daily speech, the sky remained the same. It watched, it listened, it changed shape and colour, but it never stopped watching. To the Sumerians, that sky had been alive, a vast intelligence that recorded everything. Its stars were eyes, its constellations memory. When they looked upward, they weren't gazing into distance, they were gazing into awareness. The heavens saw them, and somehow, even now, it feels like that vision never left. The world beneath those stars is transformed beyond anything the ancients could have imagined. Cities glow brighter than constellations, and machines cross the air once ruled by mythic beings. Yet above it all, the same quiet canopy remains, vast and precise. The same patterns that guided Sumerian priests still pass overhead, their rhythm unchanged. Orion still rises where he once did. Venus still burns low over the horizon. Time has altered everything below, but the map above is still the same script written in light. That continuity is what ties us to them. The Sumerians read those lights as messages, the language of the gods written in geometry. They saw in them both fate and order, both beauty and warning. The movements of the planets were not random, they were instructions. The stars weren't decoration, they were structure. To watch the sky was to understand the will of heaven. Even when their temples turned to dust, the idea endured that somewhere beyond reach, intelligence still observed creation, tracing every motion, remembering every moment. The oldest surviving star charts come from Mesopotamia. They aren't maps for navigation, but for understanding. Each symbol marks a story. The path of Jupiter, the phases of the moon, the return of eclipses, all tracked, compared, written down. It wasn't superstition, it was discipline. The priests of Ur and Nippur kept their eyes on the heavens every night, cataloguing each shift with mathematical precision. They believed that through study, they could predict divine behaviour, anticipate balance, prevent disaster. The sky was their teacher. In those early centuries, astronomy and devotion were the same pursuit. To watch the heavens was to listen to the gods speak in the language of movement. The sun was the heart of justice, the moon the measure of time, the stars the alphabet of destiny. Even now, those patterns linger in how we think. We still speak of under the same stars as a kind of unity, as if those points of light could hold witness to our stories. The ancients would have nodded. They believed exactly that. For them, the sky wasn't a backdrop. It was alive, responsive, moral. Every act below left its reflection above. The heavens weren't indifferent. They were involved. When kings fell, constellations shifted. When cities prospered, comets flared. It was as though the cosmos itself reacted to the pulse of civilization. To us that sounds poetic. To them, it was reality. The heavens recorded everything, and in return humanity was obligated to keep them in balance through ritual and respect. That relationship began to fade when knowledge replaced reverence. As astronomy became science, the gods receded. The stars turned from symbols into coordinates, their meanings replaced by measurements. Yet the sense of awe never disappeared. Even stripped of myth, the sky continues to inspire the same feeling, the awareness of being seen, of being small, of existing within something vast that endures beyond memory. The Sumerians may have called that feeling worship. We call it perspective. It is the same emotion in a different language. When astronomers today map galaxies and measure cosmic radiation, they're continuing the oldest human act, looking upward and trying to translate the pattern. The tools are different. Telescopes instead of temples, equations instead of hymns, but the gesture is identical. The sky that watched the priests of Eridu still watches us through the same infinite silence. Every discovery we make is another echo of that ancient curiosity. The Sumerians believed the gods never left the heavens, they simply moved beyond visibility. Their lights were still there, but hidden by distance. Even when their temples stood empty, they trusted that the watchers remained. They spoke of the shining ones who crossed the firmament, leaving trails of fire. They called them messengers, travellers, guardians. Later cultures would name them differently: angels, seraphs, comets. But the essence stayed the same. The sky was not empty, it was inhabited. It's tempting to see in those old descriptions the beginnings of something more modern. The idea of a universe full of intelligence, of countless worlds spinning beneath the same laws. To the Sumerians, the stars were divine stations, Each one a home of the gods. Today, we call them suns. Science and myth, separated by language, describe the same wonder. Both see the heavens as populated, alive, radiant. The difference is method, not meaning. When we send signals into space, when we search for life beyond Earth, we are reviving that same impulse. We are asking if the Watchers are still there. The Sumerians didn't need to ask, they assumed it. For them, every light in the night sky was a consciousness. The distance between heaven and earth wasn't emptiness, it was relationship. That's why their prayers always began with acknowledgement of the stars. "You who see me," they said, "remember my name." In one Sumerian hymn, written more than 4,000 years ago, a priest addresses Inanna as the light that guides the wandering. He describes her not as a goddess apart from the world, but as presence woven into its structure. Her brightness is not just a beacon, it is attention itself. To be seen by her was to exist. That belief carries an uncanny resonance with our modern understanding of observation. The notion that perception defines reality, that what is seen gains form through being witnessed. The Sumerians already lived within that truth. The sky saw, therefore the world was. The more we've learned about the cosmos, the closer we've come to confirming that same interconnection. Every atom in the body, every breath of air, every element of life was born in the heart of stars. The sky doesn't just watch, it built us. The iron in blood, the carbon in flesh, the calcium in bone, all forged in stellar fire long before Earth existed. When the ancients said that the gods descended from heaven to shape humanity, they weren't wrong. The material of life did come from above. Their myth captured the truth through imagination. Our science captures it through evidence. The result is the same recognition. We belong to the sky. In that sense, the Watchers never needed to leave. They became us. The gaze of the heavens continues through human eyes, through the instruments we build to extend our vision. The stars study themselves through our curiosity. When astronomers peer into distant galaxies, they are the sky observing its own reflection. The ancient idea of divine watchers has reversed direction. Humanity has inherited their place. But the memory of being watched still lingers. It's there in every ritual of looking upward, in every superstition about fate and stars, in every whispered hope that someone, somewhere, sees and remembers. The Sumerians built entire systems of meaning around that feeling. Their calendars, their prophecies, their symbols, all designed to remind them that the world was under observation, that nothing existed in isolation. To be alive was to be seen. Perhaps that's why their myths rarely speak of loneliness. Even in exile, even after floods and loss, the heavens remained companion and witness. The gods might withdraw their voices, but their eyes were eternal. That sense of cosmic companionship sustained them. It might be what sustains us still, even in an age where the sky has become an object of study rather than worship. We've changed our vocabulary, but not our instinct. We still find comfort in the stars, even if we no longer call them divine. In the ruins of Ur, archaeologists once found a tablet carved with a star map and an inscription that reads, "The heavens are above, and the gaze of the gods is upon the earth." The stone is cracked, the edge is missing, but the message remains legible. It's not a threat or command, it's reassurance. The gaze of the gods was not oppressive, it was protective. The Watchers weren't spies, they were guardians of order. That sentiment, quiet and enduring, defines the Sumerian spirit more than any tale of power or conquest. They didn't fear the sky, they trusted it. Modern cosmology, though devoid of gods, often arrives at similar reverence. When scientists describe the universe as self-aware through life that has evolved within it, they're echoing the same belief. Consciousness becomes the universe recognizing itself. The ancient sky that watched humanity has become the human mind watching the sky. The circle closes. The observation never stopped. It merely changed direction. The Sumerians would have understood that symmetry. In their language, the word for to see also meant to know. Vision and understanding were one act. To be seen was to be known. To see was to become part of what was seen. When they stood beneath the night sky, they weren't looking at something separate. They were participating in the gaze. The watcher and the watched were reflections of the same being. Even now, that idea holds a quiet truth. The stars we look at tonight are light from the past, messages still travelling through time. When their photons touch the eye, they complete journeys that began long before humanity existed. The act of looking becomes communion. The ancient sky that recorded our beginnings continues to record our present, frame by frame, light by light. It doesn't need language anymore. Its watching is enough. Somewhere in that infinite depth, the legacy of Sumer persists, not in temples or names, but in the human tendency to lift the gaze, to seek meaning above. We still build observatories that mirror their ziggurats, still assign significance to the stars, still trust that the universe holds memory. The instruments have changed, but the intention has not. The sky still watches, and we still answer. The priests of Nippur would recognize the rhythm of that exchange, though they would find our tools unrecognizable. Their telescopes were chants, their data written in verse, their equations sung to the heavens. We've turned their devotion into mathematics, their hymns into physics. Yet beneath all the symbols and formulas lies the same desire, to listen for what the sky might still be saying. The Sumerians believed that one day the Watchers would return, not as conquerors, but as restorers, bringing harmony back to a world that had forgotten its balance. Whether they meant gods, ancestors, or cosmic cycles, the meaning remains open. Perhaps their prophecy referred not to visitors descending from the stars, but to understanding rising toward them, to a future when humanity would remember its connection to the heavens. If that's true, then maybe the return has already begun. We send probes past Jupiter, rovers across Mars, signals toward distant suns. We've learned to write messages in the language of radio, to send our presence into the same sky that once spoke to Sumer. The watchers and the watched have become one. The sky that observes is now observed in return, still in quiet moments, when the noise of cities fades and the stars emerge as they once did over the plains of Mesopotamia. The old sense of being seen returns. It's there in the stillness, in the breath between thoughts, in the faint hum of the world turning beneath the night. The heavens have always watched, not as judges, but as mirrors. To look up is to remember what the Sumerians never forgot, that the gaze of the sky and the gaze of humanity are the same. The clay has hardened, the temples have fallen, but the watchers remain. The stars write their stories in silence, and somewhere deep within that silence, the first language still lingers, the language of observation, of connection, of memory. The sky that watched the birth of gods, of kings, of civilizations watches still, and as long as eyes remain to return the gaze, the conversation continues, unbroken across time. The story of the Anunnaki began in dust and ends there too. Dust that once formed stars drifted through space, gathered into worlds, and became soil beneath human feet. The Sumerians called that dust sacred. It wasn't just earth to them, it was the raw material of being, the memory of creation itself. Every handful carried the remains of what had come before, the sky's forgotten fragments, fallen and reborn as life. And in that belief lies the foundation of their entire story, a quiet truth that still echoes long after their words have faded. In the ruins of Eridu, beneath layers of collapsed walls and sun-baked clay, archaeologists have found traces of the first temples, simple structures of mud brick aligned with the stars. They were small, barely large enough to stand in, yet they represented the beginning of civilization. Inside them, fire once burned, offerings once smoked, and prayers once rose toward the heavens. These places were built not for grandeur but for remembrance. Each was an anchor between heaven and earth, a promise that humanity would never forget its origin. Those origins, according to the Sumerians, were never purely earthly. The gods had descended, shaped humanity, taught them order, and returned to the sky. The world they left behind was a reflection of that encounter, a place where divine and human remained entangled. The cities became the continuation of the heavens, their walls laid out according to celestial geometry, their kings serving as mediators between dust and starlight. When they looked at themselves, they didn't see separation, they saw continuity. It's strange how, thousands of years later, that same sense of connection still lingers in us. We no longer build temples to Enki or Inanna, but we still reach upward. Our machines have replaced their altars, our satellites their prayers. We launch metal and data where they once sent smoke and song. The intention is identical: to touch the sky, to be acknowledged by it, to confirm that we are not alone. The oldest impulse has merely changed its tools. What began as myth in Sumer has become science in our age. Yet both speak of the same thing: the relationship between creation and its creators. The Anunnaki, whether gods, symbols, or distant beings, represent that bridge. They are the embodiment of humanity's need to understand itself as part of something greater, something that existed before and will exist after. The Sumerians described them as radiant and watchful, bearers of knowledge, shapers of life. In a sense, they were describing what we would one day call the universe itself. The gods they imagined in human form were projections of forces that science would later define: evolution, gravity, chemistry, time. Different languages for the same mystery. As knowledge expanded, the stories didn't vanish, they transformed. The Anunnaki became archetypes, their myths rewritten through new eyes. The Sumerian gods merged into Babylonian pantheons, then into biblical echoes, then into philosophies, and eventually into questions about life beyond Earth. The names changed, but the desire to trace our lineage to the sky remained. When thinkers in the modern world began to wonder if humanity might have been influenced by visitors from the stars, they weren't inventing a new idea. They were remembering an old one. Across time, the myth persisted because it answered a need. It gave purpose to existence and structure to wonder. It reminded people that creation was not random, that life carried intention, even if that intention could not be fully known. The flood stories, the tales of descent, the hymns of creation, all shared the same rhythm: loss followed by renewal, silence followed by speech, clay followed by breath. The pattern repeated through centuries like a heartbeat, as if the world itself were retelling the same story in different forms. To the Sumerians, the end of that story was never destruction. It was return. They believed that everything born of the earth would eventually rise again to the heavens. Dust would return to dust, but in that return was not tragedy. It was completion. The same dust that once formed humans would one day form stars again. The cycle never ended. It only changed shape. When we speak of the universe now, when we trace the evolution of stars and the origins of elements, we're describing that same movement. The atoms that make up our bodies were created in ancient stars that lived and died billions of years before the Earth existed. Every heartbeat is powered by reactions that began in places too distant for imagination. When the Sumerians said that the gods shaped humanity from the clay of the earth, mixed with divine essence, they captured that truth without needing telescopes or equations. They understood, intuitively, that life is the universe remembering itself. Even their concept of immortality reflects that understanding. The Sumerians didn't believe in endless personal survival. They believed in continuation through memory, through name, through legacy. To them, to be remembered was to live on, and to be forgotten was to dissolve into silence. That's why they wrote so much, carved so carefully, prayed so precisely. They were leaving instructions for remembrance. They wanted the story to continue, even after the storytellers were gone, and it has. Every tablet that survives, every myth retold, every scholar who translates their words continues that act of remembrance. The Sumerians may have vanished as a people, but their voices are still audible. Their ideas became the foundations of law, astronomy, writing, and narrative itself. Even the simple act of recording a story like this one follows their example. We are repeating their ritual, extending their language into a new age. When we step back and look at the path humanity has taken, it feels like a slow awakening of something they began. The Sumerians built temples to bridge earth and sky. We build observatories and space stations. They recorded the motion of stars to understand divine order. We do the same to understand physics and time. They imagined gods descending from the heavens. We send our own emissaries upward. Every step of progress is an echo of their first gesture, their first attempt to connect dust and stars. Perhaps that's what makes their mythology so enduring. It's not only a story about origins, it's a story about inheritance. It reminds us that to be human is to carry both clay and light, both mortality and memory. The Anunnaki myth expresses that tension perfectly. We are made of the earth, yet drawn to the sky. We belong to the material world but dream of something beyond it. The gods gave humanity purpose, but that purpose was not servitude, it was continuation. To learn, to build, to remember, and to pass it forward. When you read the old texts, when you see the lines carved by hands long turned to dust, there's a strange familiarity in them. They wrote as though they knew someone far in the future would be listening. They addressed not just their gods, but us, the descendants who would inherit their questions. Their words move across time not as commands, but as invitations to keep asking. The sky may be older, the tools may be sharper, but the wonder remains unchanged. Even now, when we look at distant galaxies through telescopes or at deep-sea fossils through microscopes, we're participating in the same act the Sumerians began. They asked what the gods were. We ask what consciousness is. They wondered how creation began. We study how matter becomes mind. The surface differs, but the structure is identical. Curiosity itself is the inheritance. In the silence between stars there is memory. Every atom that drifts through the cosmos carries traces of what it once was, a remnant of ancient fusion, a record of creation. The Sumerians believed the gods kept tablets of destiny, where every event was written before it occurred. In a sense, the universe does exactly that. The laws of physics are its decrees. Every motion, every orbit, every transformation follows the pattern written in its structure. We read that pattern now through mathematics, but it's the same act of interpretation the priests once performed. The gods' tablets became equations, the rituals became experiments, the ore remained the same. It's easy to imagine the Sumerians standing at dusk, the sky glowing red over the Tigris, watching the first stars appear. The air filled with the smell of clay and water, the slow turning of the world beneath their feet. They would begin their evening chants, voices rising with the wind, carrying names that had already begun to blur into eternity. Those names, Enki, Inanna, Anu, Ninhursag, were not just labels. They were gestures towards something infinite, something that watched, listened, and remembered. The sound of their voices has faded, but the intention remains in every human act of wonder. The dust that covered their temples is the same dust that covers ours. The same particles drift in the air above modern cities, illuminated by electric light instead of fire, yet still ancient, still cosmic. Every breath contains fragments of those first civilizations, atoms once part of their bodies, their rivers, their skies. Nothing is lost. It only changes form. The story continues because the matter that tells it never disappears. When the Sumerians spoke of gods returning to the heavens, they didn't mean abandonment. They meant completion. The work of creation was finished, and the rest was left to humanity. In a sense, That's what history has been ever since, a continuation of divine work through human hands. We build, destroy and rebuild, always reaching upward, always remembering something we can't quite name. The story they began didn't end with their fall. It spread across continents, languages and centuries, transforming into every philosophy and science that followed. The title of their first city, Eridu, meant home built far away. It's a fitting description of humanity itself, a species born of the stars, building homes far from its origin. We have always been wanderers, always restless, always driven to extend the horizon a little further. The Sumerians told of gods who crossed from heaven to earth. Now we cross from earth toward heaven. The symmetry is perfect. The myth has turned itself inside out. And so the cycle continues, dust becoming life, life becoming memory, memory becoming story. The Sumerians believed that as long as their names were spoken, they would never vanish. Thousands of years later, we still speak them. We pronounce their words, read their symbols, retell their myths. In doing so, we prove them right. They are not gone. They live in the shape of our thought, in the rhythm of our progress, in the language that still carries traces of their speech. The story of the Anunnaki is not a closed tale. It is a reflection, a mirror in which humanity sees its own search for meaning. Whether the gods were real or imagined, whether they came from the stars or from the depths of human consciousness, the result is the same. They gave us a framework to understand ourselves. They taught that creation is not a single act, but a continuous process, that life is both inheritance and responsibility. When the wind moves across the desert of southern Iraq, it still carries grains of sand from the ruins of Ur and Lagash. Those grains drift across oceans, across continents, settling invisibly on new ground. They mix with soil, with water, with air, becoming part of new worlds. Each one is a fragment of history, a particle of memory still in motion. That movement is the story of us, restless, enduring, infinite. And so it continues. The dust remembers the stars that birthed it. The stars remember the dust that became aware. The line between them is not distance, but time. The gods who once walked the earth have become metaphors for that connection, symbols of a truth older than language, that the universe, in knowing itself through us, never ceased to speak. We are the continuation of that speech, the descendants of clay and starlight, the storytellers of creation. The Sumerians began the tale in their own tongue, but the story no longer belongs to them. It belongs to everyone who looks upward and feels recognition, who sees in the night sky not emptiness but memory. The same sky that watched them watches us still, waiting for the next verse to be written, for the next voice to rise and remember how it all began. The dust will settle again someday, as it always does. New civilizations will rise and fall. New myths will replace the old. But the rhythm will remain. The endless dialogue between matter and meaning, between the clay of the earth and the fire of the stars. That rhythm is the oldest language of all, and it speaks only one thing. Over and over, the story continues.